Hey friends, this is our Dean's fandom of fiction. In today's special we are gonna see Dean Winchester's Haunted Hunt, Doctor Who X Supernatural crossover. Sorry for disturbance, you skipped 20 seconds from here. This note for author of the fanfiction. I have given credits to author and description of the video by. If the original author wishes to reclaim copyright or remove this video, I kindly request before giving copyright strike. Please contact us using the information provided in the pinned comment. We respect and acknowledge authorship rights, and I will delete that specific video by myself. Thank you. Fiction start from here. This was new. Dean was still gasping in air gratefully, but as he looked around, he had no idea what to make of his surroundings. It looked like a bomb had gone off, the way the trees were flat, the way everything looked like it had been blown back. Dean couldn't think of any good reason for the cemetery to look like that. Then again, he couldn't think of any good reason for him to even be alive. The last thing he remembered, he'd been cutting into people in hell. He'd been ankle-deep in misery and finding new ways to make it last, make it hurt, and then he was choking on dirt and clawing his way back up out of his own grave, with the memory of hell still seared in his brain and behind his eyelids, every time the dirt fell on his face. Dean looked around the cemetery, at the evidence that something bad had happened, and laid his head down on the soft grass and dirt. He just wanted to breathe for 5 minutes. He was tired. 5 minutes turned into 10 when no one came to bother him. Though he knew he was eventually going to have to pull himself out of the grave. Someone would come looking. Someone had to come looking. A sight like that was going to draw attention. With a groan, Dean pulled himself the rest of the way up and out of the dirt, frowning as he looked down at his dirt-covered hands and clothes. It had been years in hell. He should have been rotted by now. The clothes should have looked way worse. Something was seriously wrong here. When Dean still didn't see anyone coming to investigate the scene, he called out a few times for help, but the whole place felt empty in a way that sent shivers down his spine. His first thought, now that he'd gotten over the initial panic of climbing out of the grave, was that Sam had done something stupid. And it had to be incredibly stupid too, because it seemed to Dean like hell had him right where they wanted him. He'd been marching in lockstep to their sadistic fifes and doing everything they wanted him to do. So he didn't see any reason for them to have let him go, unless Sam offered them something big. And that in itself was worrying, since Dean didn't want to think about what kind of big something Sam even had to offer, when there were things like friggin' souls on the line. Dean shook his head and forced himself to his feet. It was pretty obvious by now that no one was going to come help him, so he might as well get on with it. Figure out where he was, find a phone, figure out where Sam was, stop him from whatever idiocy he was up to. No rest for the wicked, Dean thought to himself grimly. And that statement had never been so true for Dean as it was at that moment. He closed his eyes, pushing the thought to the back of his mind. He needed to focus on finding Sam. He could think about everything else he'd been through some other time. Now wasn't the time to be selfish when Sam was probably in trouble with whatever the heck he'd done to get Dean out. He wasn't worth whatever Sam had done. Dean was surprised as he started to take a few steps forward, that he felt a little dizzier than usual, and he stopped to keep from stumbling to his knees. Taking a deep breath, he had to reorient himself. Everything felt new, different, like he wasn't used to moving in his own body. Then again, he wasn't used to moving in his own body. For one thing, he'd been in hell for so long that this mortal body was a whole other thing. And for another thing, this didn't feel like the body he'd left behind. Dean knew he'd been a bloody mess when he died, and he knew he had a whole bunch of scars from the life of a hunter on top of that. But now, he didn't see any of that. He didn't feel any of the old scars. And when he knelt down in the grass to get his balance back and checked what he could see of his body, he couldn't see any scars he recognized. What was weird was that he seemed to have a new scar that he didn't recognize. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath to steady himself. He didn't have time to think about how weird this was, or wonder what kind of creature could have left him with something like that. He had to focus. But closing his eyes was a bad idea, because the dark of his eyelids brought back a whole bunch of things he really didn't want to remember. So he opened them again quickly and then swore under his breath. Find a phone, get to Sam, deal with the rest of it later. You're probably going back to hell anyway, once you figure out what Sam did. So stop feeling sorry for yourself and get this done. Dean took a deep breath, held it, and then got to his feet, staggering several steps across the two flat expanse of the cemetery. There wasn't anything he could lean against or hold onto, when the trees had all been blown back like they were. So it wasn't until he got further into the tree line that he could take another break, get his breath, and get going. Every time he did that, he felt a little stronger until he finally stumbled on a road. From there, he was able to follow it back until he could find a place that had a phone he could use. Find a phone. Get to Sam. He was so focused on what he was doing that he didn't notice who the person was who was using the payphone ahead of him. But when he did, he took a full step back, his eyes wide. River? River's song turned his way and broke into a grin. Just who I was looking for. Hello, Dean. Dean shook his head. He should have thought of the possibility of some kind of doctor-related nonsense. He supposed a few decades of torture was good enough reason not to have space travel on the top of his list of priorities. But then, it had been the case often enough that when something happened that Dean couldn't place on the supernatural scale, it came from the doctor's kind of trouble. So, what's the story? Do I have to have a story to come see an old friend? River shot back, though the teasing sparkle in her eyes said that there was, in fact, a story. Usually, Dean said. And the timing is kind of suspect. It is, isn't it? River asked, then tipped her head toward a nearby bus bench, so the two of them could go somewhere to sit down, which Dean appreciated, though he wasn't going to say as much out loud. I'm not going to ask you if you're alright, because that would be a waste of time, she said once they were seated. See, this is why we get along, you talk sense, Dean said, leaning back against the back of the bench. The air rang with silence between them for a long moment before River spoke up again. I know you're headed back to Sam, but I also know you just came back from the dead, she said. Dean shook his head. You know, having a time-traveling friend is a lot less fun when you realize it means they know all your secrets before you know them. You're preaching to the choir, my friend, River said. She watched him for a moment longer before she tapped her vortex manipulator on her wrist. If I promise to bring you back at exactly this moment in time, so you don't lose any time finding your brother, would you agree to break in your new liver with some drinks with me? Dean raised an eyebrow at that, smiling in spite of the serious situation. No way could I turn that down. Didn't think so. River agreed with a smile before she grabbed his arm and they were off. When River and Dean arrived at an old bar that was a favorite of River's in the 50th century, at first, River didn't say anything. She knew that Dean had just come back from the dead. She had looked up the exact date so she could be there, and she knew that he was still processing. So instead, she simply let him drink in silence and watched his intake. New liver, after all. When she saw him run his finger over his lips, she knew that he was drunk enough that his lips had gone numb. So she figured he was relaxed enough to talk to her now. What do you remember? Was the first question she asked. Dean narrowed his eyes and gave her a look that clearly communicated how much he did not want to broach that particular subject. Enough, he said at last when River simply met that look with one of her own. She lived in a jail, and she was married to the doctor. No look Dean could give her could faze her. Besides, River had come to this day specifically because she knew what it meant to Dean. It was her little way of trying to pay him back, because he was always there when she needed to get away for a while and sink her teeth into a good hunt. Something to distract her from life in prison. Yes, the doctor came to visit her often, and those dates were a highlight of her life. But a girl had to exist on more than just the occasional date, and then a daily grind of prison life. And she was a psychopath. And knowing everything that she did, knowing how many times in Dean's future he would let her let the psychopath out alongside him, well, this was really just a way to repay that debt that he didn't even know she felt she owed him yet. What do you even care? Dean asked. His eyes narrowed further until they were almost slits as he turned her way fully. River let out a patient sigh. Spoilers. That's crap and you know it. You're only saying that because you don't like my answer, River said with a quiet smile. But it's the truth. Those are the rules, no peeking at your own future. Dean rolled his eyes and then leaned back and threw back a shot. I've mentioned that I hate having time-traveling friends, right? I've heard that song 1,000 times, River chuckled. Consider this my remix. River laughed outright at that. All right, that's a new one. Really? What? Do I get less funny with age? Dean asked. Spoilers. All right, that answer gets older every time you use it, Dean grumbled. River shrugged. I can't help that. I think you can. I can't help what you think either. Dean grinned crookedly at that. You know, the mysterious look is kinda sexy on you. Oh, you're going to have to do better than kind of sexy if you want to get anywhere with me, River said, though she was leaning toward him with her eyes sparkling with laughter. She really did love to spend time with Dean. They spoke the same language. Dean leaned forward, matching her body language. I'm just getting started. Clock's ticking, River shot back, biting her lip to keep back her grin. especially when Dean simply responded with a laugh that sounded like he'd forgotten how to do it until that moment. Yeah, they'd both definitely needed this. Amy was still in awe of traveling with the doctor. She'd been to space. She'd traveled in space and time in her nightie. Yeah, she really needed to find some better clothes to wear if she was going to keep this up. But for the moment, she was having way too much fun to slow down for something as boring as a wardrobe change. She was grinning as the noise of the TARDIS stopped, and she tossed a laugh over her shoulder toward the doctor and sashayed over to him. "So," she said, "where did you take me? Let's find out together," the doctor said, looking just as excited as she felt, which, of course, only had her tickled down to her toes. After all, there was her Raggedy Man, the one no one had believed her about, her hero, and he'd promised her adventures like she'd never known before. She loved this. She loved the thrill of excitement. She loved the little flip her stomach did every time she went to the TARDIS doors. She loved her Raggedy Man with his floppy hair and his floppier smile. She never wanted to stop. Still grinning, she threw open the doors, and then raised both eyebrows and spun around to face the doctor. "You took me to a graveyard." The doctor looked surprised to hear it. Amy was starting to suspect that he wasn't as good at traveling in space and time as he'd like her to believe, as if making her wait for most of her life before he came back to see her wasn't bad enough. But he quickly recovered some of his manic excitement as he stepped around her and into the cemetery. "Would you take us here, old girl?" he asked, apparently speaking to the TARDIS. Another odd quirk of his that Amy couldn't stop grinning over, since he really was such a strange Raggedy Man. But he didn't have to wait for an answer from his blue box when he saw the rest of the cemetery outside what they'd spotted in the doorway. Amy's eyebrows were just as high on her forehead as the doctor's were on his, as the two of them took in the scene. All around the area, something had flattened the trees and the earth. It reminded Amy of the pictures she'd seen in school of the aftermath of bombs dropping, and she frowned and turned to the doctor. "Did you take me into a war zone in my nightie?" she asked. "I don't think so," the doctor said, though that really just confirmed for Amy that he didn't know where they were. Not that she minded traveling by the seat of her pants, it was kind of exciting. But she felt a little vindicated in knowing that the doctor was, well, raggedy. "Well, what happened here?" Amy asked. Some of the trees were uprooted, while others looked like they'd simply snapped in half, and others looked like they'd been chopped down. The whole air held a sort of charge, like the feeling of standing in a thunderstorm, and Amy found herself shivering with goosebumps traveling up her arms. "I don't know," the doctor admitted, then gave her a crooked smile. "What do you think? Shall we find out together?" How could Amy resist an invitation like that? She grinned at him and grabbed his arm to thread hers through his, nodding sharply. "Yes, let's." Dean was grinning widely as he leaned on River, his arm around her shoulders, as the two of them stumbled like they were in a three-legged race on the way out the door. He was seriously enjoying the sound of her laugh and the tickle of her bushy hair on his nose as he leaned in and kissed her cheek. "Come on," he said in a low, throaty voice that usually got him what he wanted and at least had River laughing at him. "You're the one looking for privacy. You're drunk," River laughed. "Everything important is still working," Dean argued. River laughed again and turned her head to kiss his cheek in return. "You're definitely my type," she said, still smiling. "And you brought me all this way just to get me drunk." Dean smiled a little bit wider. One of his arms was around her shoulders, but the other he pulled around her waist until he had turned her to face him, so he could kiss her properly, and she absolutely didn't slow him down either. "I did, didn't I?" River said, sliding her arms over his shoulders. "Guy's gonna get an impression that way," Dean said without pulling far back from her mouth, speaking against her lips before he kissed her again, until she retaliated with a much more passionate kiss that had him backing up a step until his back hit the wall, and he was laughing as soon as he got a breath. River paused and then smirked at him. "You think you can handle it?" "I know I can." River's smirk broke into a smile before she grabbed his hand, pulling him along, since she was the one that actually knew where they were going. "Prove it." Dean hadn't expected the metal to feel so cold in his hand. In hell, everything was fire and pain, and he was so used to being coated in sweat and blood and salt water that he'd forgotten what cold felt like. That on its own was enough to stop him in his tracks. He was down from the rack, and that was a relief, yes, but the fact that something as simple as cold felt like a bomb that spoke to just how bad things had been these last years. "You're not backing out, are you?" Dean closed his eyes and closed his fist around the metal instrument, steadfastly not looking behind him. If he did, he'd see the face of the demon who had been torturing him, who had now promised to teach him all the best ways to cause pain, to make people beg for mercy. No, Dean said, just enjoying being on the other side of this. Good. Dean nodded once, then twice, then turned back to the guy on the rack, who was shaking and sobbing. He'd been somebody in another life, but now he was reduced to this, a quivering mass of flesh. Dean thought about hesitating. He did, but he was so tired of getting torn apart, and he didn't know if this promise of freedom would last if he equivocated. For all he knew, this was a one-time offer that they made everyone in hell, and the ones who didn't take it stayed on the hooks for eternity. He wasn't willing to take that chance. He'd resigned himself to hell for Sam, and now his brother was out there in the world and safe and alive. He'd done his part, and now, well, now he was stuck. It didn't matter anymore what he did. He might as well follow hell's orders the way he'd followed his dad's. He'd always been a tool and a weapon, right? He frowned down at the shaking, crying man in front of him, then flicked out the knife in his hand. He didn't need to be told where to start. He remembered how the demons had cut into him before. The blood he spilled was warm as it trickled down the side of his hands. Of course it was. Everything in hell was warm, except the tools of the trade. When Dean woke up, he was sweaty and out of breath, and half tangled in the sheets. It took him a long time to get his breath and his bearings, and honestly, he was grateful to River that she didn't try to touch him to calm him down. He was sure he would have lashed out at any physical contact. When his mind was still back in hell, he ran both hands down his face, while River sat with her back against the headboard, quietly watching him lose his cool. That part he was more bothered by, because he didn't want her thinking he couldn't handle himself. But then again, this woman had known exactly when to come and get him when he'd just come back to the land of the living. So, he said slowly, "How much do you know?" "All of it." River told him honestly. She obviously didn't see any point in sugarcoating it or lying to him, which was something he had always appreciated about her, even if they'd only met a few times before. "Great. It's still fresh. I'm not surprised you're dreaming about it," River said, though when Dean frowned hard at the tone of her voice, she smirked and slipped into a silkier whisper. "But I'm a little bit insulted you weren't dreaming of something better," she teased. "Not that I'm complaining, but is that what this was? Pity?" River shook her head, still smiling, and then leaned her head on his shoulder, sliding her arms around his waist. "I'm not that kind of girl. Wouldn't really know. We're just getting to know each other. And I honestly thought you had a thing for the doctor, or is that not a thing where you are in your timeline?" Dean shook his head. "Man, I forgot how confusing that is." River smirked. "You get used to it." "Yeah, just working on getting back in the saddle." "You're doing fine." River kissed his cheek. "And yes, I do have a thing for the doctor. Thank you for noticing." "Seems to be a pattern," Dean muttered. "Oh, don't be jealous," River said, and kissed him fully. "It's not your fault. I tried to kill him first. How can a girl resist?" Dean smirked at that. "Somehow, I'm not surprised." "You really shouldn't be," River said, pulling him into a much longer kiss and smiling against his mouth the whole time. "Now, are you going to keep bringing up another man while you could be having a fling with me? Because if so, I might have to check to make sure you haven't been replaced by an android. I wouldn't complain, I've dated a few, but you might be put out." Dean laughed at that and pushed her back against the pillows. "Yeah, definitely gonna need to check. Thoroughly." River's grin turned more crooked, and the next thing either of them knew, they were getting tangled up all over again, and Dean forgot for the time being about the dream that had woken him up in the first place. "Doctor, really, what's going on?" Amy was leaned over the park bench, her hair falling down over her shoulders, her eyes lidded. Somehow, that wasn't enough to get the doctor's attention away from whatever gadget he was holding and muttering to himself about, and Amy let out a huff of frustration when he saw it before she took a more direct approach. "Hey!" Amy grinned as she waved the doohickey in front of the doctor's face. "What is this thing and why are you using it to inspect a phone booth? It's not even blue." The doctor finally managed to get his gadget back, not because he was any good at stealing things back from Amy, but because she knew she actually had his attention now, which meant he would explain himself instead of being lost in his head. He was really so much work, her raggedy man. "We're not inspecting a phone booth," he said. "We're inspecting the air in this area. It's charged with Artron energy." Amy blinked at him. Which means that someone was time traveling in this area." The doctor examined his gadget, shook his head, and then set it down on the park bench in favor of licking his finger and sticking it up in the air instead. like he was testing which way the wind was blowing. See, Amy, this kind of energy clings to things that travel through time. It powers time machines and attempted time machines too. Amy smirked when she heard the tone he was using. You're not impressed, then? The doctor shook his head. Whoever is time traveling is doing it the quick, cheap, painful way. Their atoms are not going to be happy with them. Amy nodded and then tipped her head to the side. Okay, but you said that this energy sticks to anything that time travels, yeah? So wouldn't it be on us as well? The doctor grinned and pointed at Amy. Got it in one pond, he said, sounding honestly delighted that she was following his technobabble. But don't worry, the TARDIS is the luxury sports car of time travel, and I can filter out the results. So I'm not picking up any residual energy from the TARDIS. Oh, I don't know. I've seen luxury sports cars, Amy teased. Hey, don't knock the TARDIS, the doctor said as he picked his gadget up again, looked over the readings, and then shook his head. Looks like whoever was here picked up a passenger and left again. What is that, temporal kidnapping or something? Amy asked, perking up now that she could sense a little more adventure than whatever techno-sleuthing the doctor had been doing up until then. The doctor narrowed his eyes and looked thoughtful. Could be, he allowed finally, then suddenly switched back into one of his wider grins, and gestured widely for Amy to come with him. Come along, Pond. The TARDIS can track the Artron signature, and we can look into why someone would be interested in this little town in the middle of nowhere for your temporal kidnapping case. Amy smiled as she followed the doctor back to the TARDIS. This was more like it. Instead of wandering around and listening to the doctor talk to herself, she was getting more adventure. It didn't take long for the TARDIS to lock onto the signature that the doctor had been tracing, and Amy grinned, her heart pounding in her ears over the sound of the TARDIS's engines. She hadn't been traveling with the doctor for a long enough time to get used to that sound, and it still sounded like the dreams she used to have about the doctor coming back to whisk her away from her boring old life. But being inside the little blue box was louder, more exciting, and more, well, everything compared to a dream. The doctor looked up and caught her manic grin to return it with one of her own, and Amy let out a delighted laugh. The doctor was hers in a way that she'd never been able to explain to any of the therapists she'd had growing up. It was nice to be proven right after all this time. Finally, the TARDIS dinged to let them know it had landed, and Amy raced the doctor to the door, pausing only to toss her hair over her shoulder. Should I be worried that we're going after potential kidnappers and nothing but my nightie? They should be worried about you, the doctor shot back, shadow boxing as if he was fighting an opponent. Amy grinned, tipped her chin up, and then put on a passable snooty expression. That's right, she said, spinning on her heel to throw open the door. She somehow wasn't surprised to find that there was a bright, loud bar on the other side of the TARDIS doors. But even though they were on a serious mission, Amy couldn't help but stop and stare at some of the different aliens she saw walking around. They couldn't have been on Earth anymore, and they definitely weren't in Amy's time, considering the level of technology she saw all around her. And then, she saw one of the windows that had a view of stars that she'd never seen before, and she rushed that way, temporarily abandoning what she was supposed to be doing, so she could look out at them. She was never going to get tired of this, of being in space. Finally, she tore her gaze away from the window back to the doctor, who was walking through the crowd with his gadget. He stopped at the bar, and Amy grinned before she flounced over. Buy a girl a drink? The doctor glanced up at her for a moment. Do you want to try something here? The energy signature is pretty strong here. They must have stayed here for a while. Maybe we can talk to people while we try something, he said. They've got a Venusian whiskey I used to like when I was a different me. I wonder if my mouth agrees. Amy smiled to herself, thinking of when she'd first met the doctor, and watched him spit out pretty much every food or drink she'd tried to give him. You really don't change, do you? Of course I do. All the time. Change is good. Staying still is boring, the doctor said, as if that was the most obvious thing in the world. Amy smirked but kept her commentary to herself, especially when she knew she was about to be proven right anyway, and she could gloat about it as soon as it happened. And so, sure enough, when the doctor ordered both drinks and then immediately spit his out, she just started to laugh. She didn't even have to say anything, the doctor's spluttering was enough. The doctor shook his head and rubbed his mouth with the back of his hand. How did I ever like this stuff before? Pure poison, he scoffed, and Amy laughed harder. She watched the doctor flash his psychic paper at the barkeep, and then launch into an explanation of how he was investigating a kidnapping and whatnot. Though his method of asking if the guy had seen anything suspicious was ridiculous, considering the variety of aliens and assorted roughhousers in the place. Amy didn't have to know where or when they were to know this wasn't a top-dollar bar. Finally, when Amy was tired of watching the doctor flounder so much, she laughed and leaned over to catch the barkeep's attention. "Maybe you can help us," she said. "They'd have come out of nowhere, and one of them probably did what I did, looked around the whole place like it was new. Ringing any bells?" Finally, the guy started to smile and nod. "Yeah, there was a couple that came through like that, rented one of our rooms." Amy fluttered her eyelashes. "Can you tell us which one?" The guy nodded, and a few minutes later Amy was headed up the stairs with her arm laced through the doctor's, laughing the whole time. "Now, that is how you run an interrogation," she said. "Well, this is your stop." Dean and River had managed to make their way all the way back to the phone booth, where Dean had been about to call up his brother. According to River, only about half an hour had passed since they'd left, so she'd been true to her word. This was the one part of time travel that Dean didn't think he'd ever get used to. Getting right back into the swing of everyday life as if nothing had changed, and he hadn't just spent an amazing night out drinking and spending the night with a gorgeous girl. Maybe it was different for the people who actually traveled with the doctor, since they didn't have to go back to their usual lives, but it definitely took some getting used to. Dean looked around the place as he tried to get back some of that same urgency he'd had when he first arrived. Yes, he was still concerned about Sam and whatever his baby brother had done to get him out of hell, but on the other hand, now that he'd had a little distance and time to think about it, he was starting to think he had things figured out. See, River had reminded him of the other part of his hunting life, the part connected to the doctor and all the people in the guy's orbit. And he knew that there were people he hadn't met yet that had recognized him and his brother. Amy and Rory, for example. He'd met them while River was around, and that reminder was grounding. Amy had seemed perfectly comfortable with Sam, which meant, Dean reasoned, that Sam wasn't going to get himself killed. Or, at least, that he wasn't going to stay dead. So whatever convoluted scheme Sam had slapped together to get Dean back, it wasn't permanent. Dean could undo it, and then his brother could go on to meet those people that they'd already met, but in the right order for the time travelers. On the other hand, Dean had also had time to think about the implications for himself, and he was starting to get resigned to it. He remembered meeting another companion, Clara, who had taken a long time to warm up to him. She'd been scared of him. Considering what Dean remembered of his time in hell, he was starting to get a pretty good idea of what had scared her. It made even more sense when he considered that River seemed to be going out of her way to make sure he'd enjoy himself. She wouldn't tell him what was in store, but, well, if she knew that Dean was going to turn back into the monster he'd been in hell, if she knew that he was going to undo whatever Sam did, and turn into the thing that scared Clara, maybe one night of being a person in a new body was her way of helping him prepare for it. And so, with all that running through his head, thanks didn't seem to cover what he wanted to say to River, but that's what he said all the same. "Oh, anytime," River said breezily. "It's purely selfish, you know. I always know I can have a good time with you." Despite himself, Dean broke into a grin. Feelings entirely mutual. River smiled at that and kissed his cheek, but before she could say anything else, both of them paused in their conversation. When they heard the familiar whirring noise of the TARDIS nearby, sharing a glance, they broke into a run to see if they could catch the arrival of their favorite time traveler, but instead, they only caught a glimpse of the blue box as it faded into the air. River swore under her breath and then started to laugh as she turned toward Dean, shaking her head at the situation. "I love him, but he has such terrible timing sometimes, doesn't he?" Dean couldn't stop his smile, especially considering how closely River was draped over his shoulder. "You'd think he'd be better at that, considering he's a time traveler." "Oh, he'd like you to think that," River said, still obviously enjoying herself and laughing. She held up a finger to tell him to stay where he was, and then dug into her pocket to pull out a piece of paper. "I need to get back to Stormgate, but when you see him, give him this for me, would you?" she said as she quickly scribbled down a few words, and then signed it with a lipstick kiss. "You know, most people don't ask the guy they just slept with to deliver love notes to their boyfriends," Dean teased, though he took the piece of paper anyway. At this point, he'd learned to run with it. Nothing about the doctor or his friends was normal. Besides, who was he to turn away a pretty girl in need of a little company? "Oh, he's not my boyfriend," River said, though the way she said it left her laughing and Dean more than a little suspicious about what kind of arrangement she had with the guy. She laughed even more at his expression, and then leaned over to steal a kiss. "Don't overthink it, handsome." "Yeah, that's something no one has ever accused me of doing before. Which is a shame, because you're so smart you sometimes leave yourself in the dust rushing ahead of your own thought process," she shot right back, barely even pausing for a breath. Dean shook his head at her. River. Oh, don't give me that look, she said, waving her hand at him. I've known you longer than you think I have. Every girl needs a best friend with benefits, don't you think? Dean couldn't help but laugh. It was the only way to deal with River when she was like this. Can't argue that. So don't try, she said before she kissed his cheek again, leaving a faint mark of lipstick, and then flounced off, waving over her shoulder. See you later. Sounds like spoilers to me. He called back. Is it? River asked, pulling off a passable imitation of innocence. Before she laughed delightedly and disappeared in a streak of light, to go back to wherever Stormsage was. Dean shook his head and then headed back to the phone booth. No more distractions. He was going to find his brother, and he was going to find out what had happened to pull him out of hell, and he was going to fix it. Of course, the kiss-stained note in his back pocket left Dean with the sneaking suspicion that he was in for at least one more distraction. But hey, if that happened, maybe he could get the doctor to give him a ride straight to Sam. Yeah, and while he was dreaming up best-case scenarios, he'd like to retire in Hawaii with a nice girl and have 3 kids. You know, for a time traveler, you sure are good at getting somewhere just a smidge too late. Amy was standing in the room that the bartender had pointed out to them with her hands on her hips as she surveyed the scene. Someone had obviously been here before them. Housekeeping hadn't cleaned the place up yet. But aside from a few wet towels, they hadn't really left anything behind. This was the second time in as many stops in the TARDIS that they'd found nothing but an empty space, and Amy found herself once again doubting the doctor's ability to actually be on time. In fact, all things considered, she was sure she should just assume that the doctor never knew what he was doing, and that he was always late. It had taken him years instead of the 5 minutes he'd promised her, before he came back for her, after all. Why would a pressing time kidnapping question be any different? He really did drive her crazy sometimes. The doctor stepped into the room behind her and frowned when he saw what she did, that it was empty, before he whipped out the thing he'd been using before to scan for energy. We must have just missed them, he said. Maybe a minute or two. Amy rolled her eyes when she heard it. Oh, and that's supposed to make it better? Oi, don't knock the TARDIS, the doctor warned, one finger pointed her way. She's just following the trail these time skippers left behind. And trailing behind, Amy pointed out in a huff. The doctor pursed his lips and then let out a huff right back at her, before he took a look at his readings, and once more pocketed his device. Well, no point in standing around here, then, right? He said, holding out his hand to her. Let's get back to the TARDIS. Amy couldn't help but smile as she took his hand, and the two of them headed back through the bar, toward where they'd left the TARDIS. Even with as frustrated as she could be with him and his blue box and his constant tardiness, she still loved this. And as long as she kept him on his toes, he'd keep up with her. So it all worked out in the end, didn't it? Seriously, doctor, she said once they were back inside and he was all bundles of energy as he moved around the console room. We are going to catch a time kidnapper, right? Amy could swear she heard the TARDIS make a sound from deep within its confines in response. The doctor looked between Amy and the TARDIS, and then patted the console affectionately. Amy, this old girl has seen wars and wonders, and he paused, frowning down at some readouts, before he started to shake his head. No, this is not the kind of thing you play games with. Amy leaned forward. What's wrong? She doesn't want to land, the doctor said, toggling one of the controls more aggressively, but the TARDIS didn't seem to respond at all. Why? If I knew, she wouldn't be doing this to me, the doctor said, obviously frustrated though before he could really get worked up. The tone of the noises the TARDIS was making shifted into ones that Amy better recognized, and they landed a moment later. See, now, that wasn't so hard, was it? Amy asked, though she wasn't sure if she was asking the doctor or the TARDIS. She knew that the TARDIS was alive, and that it seemed to have a mind of its own, but she also couldn't resist the urge to tease the doctor. So, she was probably teasing them both at the same time. She could walk and chew gum at the same time, after all. The doors opened up, and Amy almost laughed when she saw that they were right back where they started. She could even see the phone booth in the distance. Seriously? What was so hard about landing here again? Amy asked both the doctor and the TARDIS. Again? That's the question of the day, isn't it? The doctor said, shaking his head at the TARDIS before he stepped out of the door with Amy, squinting at some readouts on his machine, before he started to march in a new direction. Doctor, she called out after him. She hadn't been expecting to hear someone else echo the name. Doc. Amy turned toward the doctor, who had paused at the voice. Doctor, do you have another time traveling friend you haven't told me about? Several, the doctor said, already walking toward the sound. Though this particular friend doesn't usually time travel on his own. Intrigued, Amy followed the doctor until they found a young man around Amy's age, wearing a grin and a plaid shirt, as he waved at the two of them. "Hey Doc." "Hey Amy." Amy's eyebrows shot up, but the doctor didn't even seem fazed by the fact that this guy seemed to know who she was. "Hello Dean. Time traveling without me?" Dean broke into a crooked grin and shrugged with his hands in his back pockets. "Just a quick jump with a friend. She says hi, by the way." He held out a piece of paper, and Amy couldn't hide her curiosity. Looking over his shoulder to see the neatly printed message there, took him for a little spin. "I'll take you for one next time, sweetie. Zoxo." There was no name in the signature, and Amy turned with her whole body toward the doctor. "Oh, I have so many questions right now." "Not now, Pond," the doctor said, pocketing the piece of paper. "So many questions," Amy insisted. "That's pretty much the usual with him, isn't it?" Dean pointed out with a laugh. "Nice pajamas." Amy made a face. "And who are you, exactly?" "Oh, right. I guess we haven't met yet," Dean said, then held out his hand with a winning smile. "Dean Winchester." "Amy Pond," she replied, sizing him up. He was definitely cute, and he seemed nice enough, but she still wasn't sure what to think of the fact that he already felt a step ahead of her. On the other hand, the doctor seemed to take the whole thing in his stride. He'd obviously met this guy before, and Amy wanted to know what the history was. "He leave you behind too?" she asked at last, unable to resist the chance to needle the doctor yet again about his unkept promises. "Sweetheart, I don't get left behind," Dean said with the kind of easy smile that Amy had seen countless times before on similarly good-looking guys. "I have a job that needs doing, so I stay here while the doc does his job. They just sometimes happen to overlap." Amy pursed her lips and then pointed at Dean. "First of all, never call me that again," she said, and Dean held his hands up in a gesture of peace. "But secondly, I'm going to want to hear the story." She pointed at the bench beyond where they were standing. "So, let's hear it, then." Sam hadn't heard the sound of the TARDIS. He had been too wrapped up in other matters. Specifically, Ruby. Sam honestly didn't know what he would have done without Ruby, though there was always that voice of doubt in the back of his mind pointing out that if his dad was there, if Dean was there, they would have warned him away from her. But Dean was dead. Dad was dead. So Sam wasn't exactly inclined to listen to even the memory of their disapproval. It wouldn't have been the first time that Sam ventured off the straight and narrow path that his father and brother seemed so determined to lay out for him. Going to college had been a fight. Quitting hunting had been a fight. Now, lying in bed with Ruby, he was sure that this would have been a fight too. Maybe that was part of the reason he stayed with her. Maybe there was more to it than the comfort she gave him, and the way she helped him to hone his powers when everyone else before her had insisted that he do things their way, that he ignore what he was. Maybe there was a part of him that felt those reminders of Dean's and Dad's disapproval, and reveled in remembering them at all. And then on the other hand, maybe with both of them gone, a weight had been lifted from Sam's shoulders. Suddenly, he didn't have anyone telling him what he should do, what he should be. He had spent 1 year with Dean trying to save him, trying to give him the best last year of his life that he could. But now, his identity wasn't swallowed up in his brother. Now, he had tried everything and couldn't undo what had been done. So what was stopping him from making his own choices about how to move on with his life? It helped that Ruby let him mourn in a way that he hadn't been allowed to do before. Lately, it seemed like one loss had been stacked on top of another until he could hardly breathe. But Ruby let him get lost in that feeling. She didn't try to drown it out with another hunt. She let him get lost in her instead. It was a terrible decision, a selfish decision, and he knew it. But he was so tired of doing the right thing all the time, and it was nice to let go. So, no, Sam hadn't been thinking about much of anything outside of Ruby when the TARDIS landed not far from where the two of them were wrapped up in each other. And even if he had heard the TARDIS, he probably would have actively ignored the sound. He didn't want to get caught up in anything to do with the doctor, not when the guy had allowed his brother to die without even trying to save him. Which meant that there was no possible way Sam was prepared to open the door to his room at a knock and to see his brother standing there. The bottom dropped out of Sam's stomach. Dean. He couldn't do or say anything for what felt like an eternity as he stood there, frozen in the door. The last time he had seen his brother, Dean had been broken and bloody and dead. And now, here he was, standing there whole and alive, and Sam didn't even know how to begin to process this. And then, before he could get his feet underneath him, Ruby cut in with an excuse about pizza and a jab that had Dean smirking and thinking Sam had called her by the wrong name. He hated when she did that, but he also loved when she did that. And he appreciated that Ruby didn't immediately bust him to Dean when he'd just gotten his brother back. He didn't know what this was, or how long Dean would be back, or if this was just another cruel prank like the one the trickster had played on them before. But he didn't want to have the Ruby fight when he had much better things to do, like trying to figure out how this was even possible. Sam kept staring at his brother, and the thing was, Dean didn't look like he was faring much better at all. Sam kept catching him looking at Sam like he was trying to drink in every moment, and that finally was what brought him out of his stupor. After all, the last time he'd seen his brother look like that, Dean had been gearing up to tell Sam goodbye, and Sam wasn't interested in any long goodbyes. He wasn't interested in any goodbyes. He was done getting hurt. That was the whole point of everything he was doing with Ruby. He didn't want to be kicked around anymore. And around the same time Sam finally got his feet back underneath him, he realized that Dean was accusing him of masterminding some convoluted scheme to save him, and that was when he broke form and snapped. Dean had no idea what he had been through. No one would bargain with him. No one would let him swap places. No one would give him anything. And if Dean thought differently, he didn't know what Sam had been through in the last months. When he'd laid it all out on the table, Dean blinked at him and then shook his head, looking suddenly tired. "We've got to figure this out, Sammy." "Do we?" Sam shot back. "I mean, you're back, aren't you?" "Yeah, but that's all that matters to me." Dean fell silent. He obviously didn't know what to say, but then again, they had never been good at this part, at knowing how to navigate how much they both needed each other, Dean especially. But then, finally, Dean cleared his throat. "You remember River Song?" Sam narrowed his eyes before he did, finally, place the name, and then his eyes narrowed further. "You mean the doctor actually stepped up after all that fighting?" "No, I don't think it was him," Dean said, frowning. "Though he did give me a lift." "Of course, because why would he do anything useful?" Sam said dryly. Dean rolled his eyes at that but didn't pick up the fight. "Point is, River knew where I was gonna be when I crawled out of that grave, Sammy. I think she knew what got me out, and she took me out drinking like she was bucking me up before a big fight. But she didn't tell you what it was," Sam surmised. "No, of course not. Hey, you've seen the same movies I have, laws of time travel and all. I really don't want to hear it." Sam cut in before Dean could get going. He loved his brother, and he knew that Dean could quote pretty much every cult sci-fi movie by heart. But he was still reeling, and he still wanted to be sure that whatever had brought his brother back wasn't going to tear them apart all over again. He couldn't take that. He really couldn't. But if Dean could tell Sam was still wrapping his head around everything, he didn't actually point that out. What he did instead was smirk, put his arm around Sam's shoulders, and say, "So, how about we grab the food you and what's-her-name were going to have?" Sam let out a laugh of disbelief, and then brushed Dean's hand off his shoulder. "Shut up. Okay, so are you going to tell me who your cute friend is, or am I supposed to just assume you two are dating?" The doctor looked up from what he had been doing, checking the date to see what it was that had drawn the mysterious River Song to this day in particular, and then made a face at Amy. "Really, now, Pond, I'm still too new to know if I even have a type. Is it like apples? You have to try all sorts of different dating opportunities to figure out what you like best, now that you're all new?" Amy grinned and leaned forward, both eyebrows raised as she caught the doctor's attention. "Are you experimenting?" The doctor shook his head in disbelief, still mostly distracted by what he was seeing on the TARDIS readouts. There was something familiar about the date, but with Amy teasing him and carrying on, he couldn't quite place what it was. "Is that really the first thing on your mind?" he asked. "He's very cute," Amy said, once more leaning over the console with trouble dancing in her eyes. "Then you can experiment with him," the doctor said, absently waving one hand. He'd dealt with this before, companions who got caught up in their own little dramas. Donna and her quest to find someone to settle down with. Even Rose had flirted with plenty of little humans and others. It seemed like such a distraction sometimes, and at other times, he still remembered wondering if he wanted that. If he would ever want that. "That's absolutely not the point," Amy said, though she was laughing as this time she shifted so that she could look at the readouts over his shoulder. "What is it you're doing, exactly?" "Checking the date," the doctor said, frowning as he tapped his fingers against the console, before he spun away from it and started to shake his head as he moved around the console room. Maybe moving helped him think better in this new body he'd been in previous ones that thought kinesthetically. After all, there's something familiar about it, but I just can't place it. Seemed like a perfectly normal day to me, Amy said with a shrug. You know, other than the trees all being knocked down, and the time-traveling kidnapping, she grinned. Why don't you ask your boyfriend? He's the one who asked us to take him to his brother. Sounded like the Sam person did something stupid we need to fix anyway. The doctor had stopped listening to Amy halfway through what she was saying, though, and he spun around before she'd finished her sentence, pointing at her with a manic grin. Right, he said, tapping her on the end of the nose as she looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Right, that's absolutely not what's going on. But I've just remembered what it is. Well, that's good, Amy said. So, what now, doctor? Absolutely nothing, he said, still grinning and flush with success. He was still getting used to being him, and this new him loved to be right, even if he was still getting back up to speed. Amy narrowed both eyes and pursed her lips. Want to run that one by me again? We don't need to do anything, the doctor said. I just remembered what this day is, and it's the day Dean comes back from the dead. The beginning of the rest of their lives. Amy held up both hands, framing him with them. You're still not making any sense, doctor. Yes, well, the Winchesters have never been normal. To be fair, I've had another friend who came back from the dead. But there were extenuating circumstances. Mind you, these boys also have extenuating circumstances. Not quite the same as the heart of the TARDIS rewriting reality. Doctor, focus, Amy said, one hand on her hip. Right. He spun in place and then pointed at her. The short version is this. Those men are monster hunters and have been since they were kids. All those things people talk about as monsters in the closet or under the bed, their job is to keep those things from hurting the rest of humanity. So you can imagine that means they deal with the kind of impossible things that you promised to show me. Amy smiled. So, when are we going to fight ghosts or whatever it is that they're working on today? Maybe not today, the doctor admitted. How would you like to have to go right back down to work right after coming back from the dead? He paused, tapping his fingers against the console. That's why our friend the kidnapper whisked him off to a bar. Better reintroduction to the world, Amy finished for him. The doctor smiled a little wider. This was one of the many reasons he'd wanted Amy to travel with him. She could finish his thoughts and sentences, she was clever, and he loved traveling with clever humans. He loved people like Amy, who looked at the world in new ways. That was why he kept traveling. He wanted to see the universe through their eyes. It was more beautiful that way. Amy was nodding to herself as she thought over everything the doctor had to say. So, we're just being a taxi service to a couple battered monster hunters? The doctor smiled her way, though it wasn't the usual manic grin. Instead, it was a smile full of warmth. Not every adventure is as big as our last one, he said. But I think it's the smaller ones that are more important, don't you, Pond? You grew up in that big, empty house. Don't you know how much better it is when you have people around? Someone to be there when you need them? That's just as important as saving a spaceship full of people. Not every act of heroism is so obvious. Amy's expression softened as well, and then she laughed and shook her head. Okay, you're right, but I'd still like to fight a vampire or something. The doctor grinned and patted the TARDIS console. Oh, I'm sure it'll happen, he said. Dean recognized you, so we'll be meeting him earlier in his timeline. Which is still so weird. You know that, don't you? Amy teased. It's only weird to humans, the doctor defended. Amy smiled and reached over to knock the doctor in the shoulder. Hey, did I say it was a bad thing? At that, the doctor broke into a teasing grin. I'd certainly hope not, Pond. Otherwise, what's the point of coming out to see the world if all you're going to do is impose your own standards of reality on it? That's no fun. Amy laughed. That's the Raggedy Man I know. With that, she settled back against the railing of the TARDIS, watching the doctor work. She was glad for moments like this. She had meant what she'd said before in the Starship UK. She loved that the doctor was kind and old and wonderful, and seeing him take the time out of his hectic adventures, seeing him slow down for long enough to make sure that an old friend was going to be all right. Well, everything felt right. It had taken a long time before Dean even started to consider the idea that Sam hadn't been the one behind his resurrection. He still wasn't entirely sure that Sam wasn't lying to him. But on the other hand, he had run into the doctor and River since coming back to life. So the idea that it was something new, something he and Sam hadn't dealt with yet, wasn't that far-fetched. It would be nice if it was something space-related. Hell had been, well, hell to deal with. Surely space would be better. And that was what finally broke him out of reuniting with his brother, and trying to drink in every second of his brother standing there, alive, not in hell. He needed to talk to the doctor. River might have been tight-lipped about what was going on, but the doctor could be convinced, he was sure. Maybe. Well, it was worth a try. He noticed that Sam wasn't glaring as hard at the TARDIS anymore, too, and figured that was one good thing about coming back to life. Maybe Sam would get over the fact that the doctor hadn't helped him skirt around his death pact, if the guy had always known that he was coming back. The doctor talked about maintaining time and history and all that. Maybe he was just waiting for the boys to catch up to this part. "Hey Doc," Dean called out, knocking on the outside of the TARDIS. The door opened and Amy grinned at both of them. She was still wearing a nightgown for some reason. "Hey, boys, nice look," Dean said as the two of them slipped past her into the TARDIS. Dean kind of liked the other TARDIS look better, but then again, he figured he would always be partial to the one he'd traveled in when he was a kid. But the view was definitely helped by a hot redhead in a nightgown. "Down boy," Amy said without missing a beat. Dean grinned. He didn't know how the doctor managed to find the best people to travel with, but they were always fun to play with. "The doc in? He's checking something on his time travel doohickey." Amy waved her hand. "I tried to get him to slow down and explain it to me in small, plain English, but he doesn't do that." "Yeah, I know." Amy grinned, leaning against the railing. "Oh, yes, you can stay. Hate to tell you this, Amy, but I've been doing this longer than you have." "Bet I have you beat." "Since I was 8, Dean said, grinning triumphantly. 7, Amy shot back. Dean's eyebrows shot right up, but then he almost laughed when he saw that Amy looked just as triumphant about winning their argument as he had felt only seconds ago. "Okay, well played," Dean said, joining her as she leaned on the railing. "So, how'd you meet him?" "He showed up at my house, ate half my pantry, and promised he'd be back in 5 minutes. She blew out a frustrated breath. "Fast forward 12 years. Wait, seriously?" Dean shook his head. "I thought the fact that we only saw him every few years growing up was one thing." "Oh, I made sure he knew exactly how I felt about it," Amy promised. "Good," Sam put in. He had been hanging back slightly from the conversation. Dean didn't think he was entirely comfortable with the doctor, or anything associated with him yet, even if Dean wasn't dead anymore. But it clearly couldn't keep his mouth shut on this part. He needs someone around to tell him when he's being an idiot. "Nice to see you too, Sam," the doctor said. "If I'm wrong, I'll say so." "Oh, I like him too," Amy said, pushing off of the railing to spin to face Sam. But when she saw that Sam looked genuinely mad at the doctor instead of playfully teasing, her expression shifted, and she looked between Sam and the doctor. "Okay, what happened?" "It's fine," Sam started to say, but seeing as Amy didn't look like she was going to let it drop, Dean cut in. "I died," Dean said, "and the doctor wouldn't help Sam save me." Amy narrowed her eyes as she looked between them. All three of them. Her gaze finally landed on the doctor, and she pointed a finger his way. "That doesn't sound like you." "He's not dead," the doctor pointed out, "and that was a long time ago, for me. A lifetime ago." "Not really helping your case," Amy said, sounding exasperated, but the kind of exasperation that came from trying to help someone and watching them dig themselves deeper into a hole. Dean absolutely knew that feeling. "Time travel," Sam said, shaking his head. "It's fine." He knew Dean was coming back, apparently. "Still," Amy said, frowning. "Yeah, still," Sam agreed. Dean looked between the others in the TARDIS, frowned, and then shook his head. "Okay, that's it," he said, slipping over to run his hands over the console. It still felt the same as the one that had let him fly it, though he somehow doubted that the TARDIS would be willing to do that again, now that he'd literally been through hell and back. Still, there was something calming and comforting about the psychic touch he could feel when he reached out to the console. "What do you think?" "Huh?" he asked the TARDIS. "Get away from this place for a little while and have a party?" The TARDIS dinged happily in response. "Oi," the doctor said, pointing a finger Dean's way. "Don't steal my girl." "Wouldn't dream of it. I've got my own ride," Dean said without missing a beat, though his crooked grin told everyone there that he was definitely at least thinking of taking the TARDIS for a joyride. When the doctor gave him a dry look that clearly communicated how much he wasn't amused with Dean's antics, Dean laughed and held both hands up in a gesture of peace. "Hey, come on. I just came back from the dead. I think that warrants ice cream and a trip to the stars to see the world from above, right?" He grinned over at Amy. "That's where he took me and Sam when we first met." Amy spun to face the doctor, her long, red hair flying out behind her. "Hey, how come you took them to space?" "But I had to wait for you for years. The TARDIS wasn't on fire when I met them," the doctor said, but that just had Dean bursting out laughing. "Wait, why did you set the TARDIS on fire?" "It wasn't on purpose," the doctor said, sounding indignant, but Dean was already laughing too hard to care. After 40 years in hell, he needed that laugh too. Donna made a face when the first thing that happened when they walked out of the TARDIS was that she heard the buzzing of a wasp nearby, and she kept that face on until she had double-checked that the buzzing came from a nest, not from a flip-pin giant wasp like the one they'd just fought off with Agatha Christie. Once she saw that everything looked normal, well, as normal as things could be with the doctor, she relaxed and turned to face him as he came out of the TARDIS with her. "So," she said brightly, "where are we, then?" The doctor looked around, making a show of it, though Donna had seen him glance at the TARDIS screen and knew he had cheated. He just liked to be dramatic and make people think he was a super alien who could tell place and time just by sticking his finger in the wind. And sometimes Donna let him get away with it. After all, she was starting to see just how much he needed cheering up all the time. So she didn't call him out on his dramatic nonsense as he spun in place and then declared, "Looks like we're in Kansas again, Donna." Donna smiled when she heard it. Last time they'd been in Kansas, they had run into a teenage boy that she'd then helped raise in the past, and she'd actually been looking forward to seeing him again. "How long since the last time, though?" she asked. "Are we, like, in Kansas during the age when the Native Americans didn't have to worry about all the settlers? Or are we in Kansas in the 39th century or something?" "Good question," the doctor said with a smile. "Not really that different from the last time we were here, to tell the truth. Looks like a little over 10 years since that incident with the angels." 10 years. Donna's eyebrows were high as she mulled that one over. A lot could happen in 10 years, especially with a boy who, even at a young age, was fighting off creatures like the weeping angels. "Well then," she said, dusting her hands off, "let's see what there is to see, shall we?" The doctor smiled and gestured for her to lead the way, not that Donna knew where she was going. They seemed to have landed in the middle of nowhere, and they'd been walking for about 10 minutes before they saw the first sign of civilization, an abandoned farm building. Donna and the doctor shared a wordless glance before they headed for the building, but before they'd even reached it, they knew they were on the right track when they could hear raised voices. "I'm telling you, cause none of it makes any sense." The voice sounded vaguely familiar to Donna, but much older, so she had to look to the doctor for him to nod confirmation in mouth of Dean before she dared to put a name to the voice. The second voice, however, wasn't one that either of them recognized. "That's the plan." "Screw the plan," Dean shouted over the second voice. "You and I both know it's not right. You're supposed to be the good guys, and you're trying to stage a cockfight between me and my brother, just to give you some pawns in your game. That's not. It is, and you know it." Donna and the doctor shared a look, both of them raising eyebrows, so that they looked like mirror images of each other. Whoever Dean was talking to, it was obvious they did not get along. "Any idea what that's about?" Donna whispered, one hand cupped to her mouth. The doctor shrugged openly. "One way to find out." Donna grinned and took the lead, only waiting long enough for the doctor to sonic the lock on the door before she strolled in, grinning widely. What seems to be the problem here, boys? Once she was inside, however, she was nearly taken aback when she saw the scene. She could recognize Dean somewhat, but he was a far cry from the teenager or the little boy that she'd known. He was fully grown, and what's more, he'd drawn himself up to his full height while he was arguing with the man across from him, so Donna could see just how much he'd grown. The other man was almost as tall as Dean was, though there was something about him that Donna couldn't quite place. She didn't know if it was the long coat or the look in his eye, but something had all the alarm bells going off in her head, that this wasn't a normal person. Not that it took a genius of the doctor's caliber to know that anything Dean was facing wasn't normal. Even Donna knew that much. "Doc." Dean's entire demeanor changed, and he broke into a grin. "Perfect timing. You can help me convince Cause here that letting someone else walk around in my skin is a bad idea." "Why on earth would you do that?" the doctor asked, looking perfectly mystified, which was a relief to Donna, since after everything she'd seen with the doctor, she wouldn't be surprised if there was some alien race out there that was perfectly fine with being skinwalkers or something like that. Might be where the old horror stories came from, now that she thought about it. Dean gestured at the doctor with a look of triumph, and then turned to face his friend, apparently Cause, with both hands outstretched. "See, even the time-traveling alien can see it's stupid. Heaven isn't interested in the opinion of an outsider," Cause replied, and Donna was once again struck by how different he was. She didn't know what it was about him, but listening to him speak definitely had her convinced that he was more powerful than he let on. And what was that about heaven? The doctor must have caught that reference too, but if he had, he wasn't saying anything about it. "Well," he said, in that drawn-out way of his that was both endearing and annoying, like pretty much everything else about him, in Donna's opinion. Maybe heaven should think about expanding its horizons. And who are you, exactly, claiming to be from heaven itself? Kaz met the doctor's gaze. I don't claim to be from heaven, he said in a tone that suggested he was offended, but without the full emotion behind it. I am. No, really, Donna said, snorting out a laugh. Really, Kaz said flatly. Donna blinked. He was serious. She turned to look at Dean, who didn't look like he was laughing, and she shook her head. What is he talking about, Dean? Dean let out a long breath. Right. Introductions. Guess you haven't met him yet or something. No idea where we are in the timeline for you. He gestured between the other 3 people in the room. Kaz, this is the doctor and Donna. Doctor. Donna, meet Kaz. He's a pain in my. Yeah, we heard the shouts from all the way at the TARDIS, Donna said. Nice to meet you. Kaz sighed but tipped his head in acknowledgement. Hello. Don't just stand there like an idiot, Dean said, rolling his eyes at Kaz. Introduce yourself. You already did, Kaz pointed out. I gave your name. Kaz pinched the bridge of his nose, but when Dean crossed his arms and gave Kaz a look that clearly said he wasn't getting out of the social niceties, he offered Donna his hand. Castiel, Angel of the Lord. Donna had been ridiculously entertained watching Dean lay down the law with Kaz right up until she heard his full title. And then, she couldn't help but look between Dean and the doctor, surprised when Dean seemed to take the revelation in stride, even though Deborah had erased her memory from Dean and the doctor when she saved them from the weeping angels. But the doctor, on the other hand, was blinking more than normal, and he had a strange expression on his face as he rubbed his forehead. That couldn't be a good sign. Hey, Doc, you okay? Dean put a hand on the doctor's shoulder, frowning when he saw that his friend had a hand to his head, obviously disoriented. Anything that could make the doctor look like that couldn't be good. The doctor had looked like he was off his game. But as soon as Dean said something and pointed out to him that he was off, he straightened up and tried to brush off Dean's concern. Dean could relate. He never knew what to do when people were worried about him either. Way easier to worry about other people than himself, after all. But by that time, Donna was also concerned, though Kaz was watching their interactions with his head tipped to the side and his eyes narrowed, the way he watched just about everything lately. It was maddening, really. Dean was sure there was some shred of humanity in Kaz. He could see it sometimes in snatches of moments when Kaz would let down his guard. But apparently, that shred didn't want to come out in the face of aliens, or something. Doctor? Donna was close to the doctor, but hadn't put a hand on him yet, probably trying to decide how concerned she should be. She looked over at Dean, and the 2 of them shared a frowning look before, without a word spoken between them. They each took an arm and led the doctor to sit down, all while the doctor protested every second of it. I'm fine, the doctor said. Just some nasty psychic feedback, that's all. Oh, is that all? Dean said dryly, not letting up on his hold on the doctor at all. Not sure where it's coming from, but yeah, that's all, the doctor said, rubbing his forehead. He closed his eyes, obviously trying to concentrate, and while he was doing that, Dean took a moment to say hi to an old friend. Long time no see, he said, grinning before he kissed Donna's cheek. I see you haven't changed at all, Donna said with a fond smile. Aside from shooting up about a foot. Do you ever stop growing? I'm going to be Godzilla when I grow up, Dean replied without missing a beat. Donna burst into a laugh. Oh, I'd love to see that, right? Dean was smiling now. He hadn't realized how badly he needed this break from all the crap going down with the angels and demons, and their stupid plans to end the world, until he suddenly had Donna and the doctor with him, and he realized he missed teasing and playing in problems as simple as psychic feedback. Only problem is, I think I'd have to hunt myself. You shouldn't be hard to find, Donna pointed out, if you're the size of Big Ben. Dean grinned even wider and then spun her around in a hug. I've missed you, you know that? Donna looked surprised by the spinning hug, but she didn't argue with it either. I'm surprised you even remember me, she admitted. Last time I saw you, you were a kid, and she trailed off. And now I'm very much not, Dean said, the grin turning into something more crooked. Donna put her hand on her hip, looking amused, which wasn't exactly the reaction Dean had been hoping for. Most girls couldn't hold up against the look. You really haven't changed a bit, Donna said in the kind of tone that said she was seeing Dean the kid, and not Dean the grown man. Dean shook his head and pushed aside his disappointment. So, he said, what about you? What have you and the doc been up to? You haven't met me and Sam again. So I'm trying to figure out where you are in this whole mess. Time travelers. What a pain, right? Donna said with a cheeky smile. Always, Dean agreed. How do you cope with him every day? Oh, barely, Donna said, looking even more entertained. Really, the doctor broke in. looking perfectly insulted, even if he also still looked distracted by the headache that must have been building behind his eyes, judging by the way he kept rubbing them. Cause broke in, drawing Dean's attention away from flirting and from the doctor's headache. "We don't have time for this." "Sure we do," Dean said. "The doc's a time traveler. We don't have time for this." Literally isn't in his vocabulary, right, Doc? "That's not actually how it works," the doctor said with a smile that looked too tired for Dean's liking. Dean frowned and crossed the gap, so he could put a hand on the doctor's shoulder, dipping his head to catch his gaze. "Seriously, Doc, you don't look so good. You alright?" "I'm fine," the doctor said, but when he looked up, Dean saw he could have sworn he saw dust in the corners of the doctor's eyes. And all at once, Dean got it. Before he died, he'd had troubles just like that. At the time, he hadn't been able to remember all of it or even understand it. But once he died and been brought back in a body that didn't have any of his old scars or old hurts, the angelic resurrection had also healed the remnants of the weeping angel in his head, along with the memories that had been hidden by Deborah's blessing. It hadn't happened all at once, of course. He hadn't even thought about angels until he met Kaz, and everything that had happened since he woke up from the dead had been so much more pressing than a teenage memory of angels, that what little he did remember hadn't seemed important. But then, eventually, maybe after a long hunt, he couldn't remember he'd crashed in a motel room, and stared up at the ceiling, and got lost in thinking when he was hurting too badly to slip easily into sleep. And then he'd remembered. He remembered Deborah and Donna and the doctor and the weeping angels and the headaches. It hadn't seemed important at the time. If anything, it was another annoying reminder that the angels had been interfering in his life. He'd taken forever to go to sleep at the time because he was so caught up in being frustrated with all the interference from angels and God and everyone else. But hey, if he'd had to go through all that just to remember that he and the doc had met an angel, the least he could do was help the doctor do the same. "I think I know what the problem is," Dean said. Then, just to bug his new angelic friend, he added, "It's Kaz." The doctor's head was spinning. What he tried to play off as just a little psychic feedback was turning into something far more worrisome, and at this point, he was going to have to admit it, especially when he closed his eyes and the next thing he knew, he saw the image of a weeping angel behind his eyelids. That was strange enough. As far as he knew, he'd only faced the weeping angels once, with the help of Sally Sparrow, and considering every detail she had known about that encounter, and how long she had held on to the information, he was sure she would have told him if this was a side effect. Or maybe she didn't know to tell him, and this was a side effect of the angel's victims. That was possible, he supposed, though he couldn't remember hearing anything about stories of weeping angels crawling in people's heads. They were supposed to be the nicest psychopaths in the universe, killing people slowly. That's what he'd told Martha. Maybe it was time he reevaluated what he knew and didn't know. He sat down and heard through the fog of his headache, Dean trying to explain the situation. "Happened when I was a kid. I mean, coming back from the dead by angelic intervention apparently has its advantages, like losing weeping angel infections and memory blocks all in one blow." Memory blocks. That would make sense. But still, the doctor found himself frowning. There weren't many beings in the universe powerful enough to put a memory block in him that he didn't notice. Sure, he and his people were only low-level telepaths, but he was aware of his mind. Or, well, at least, he tried to be. Maybe he was sometimes preoccupied with other things. And maybe he was getting old enough now that his head was too full to pay it much attention. He'd lived so long and seen so many things that he was even lying about his age now. Like a vain old man trying to have a midlife crisis well beyond the middle of his life. Alright, so maybe he wasn't as good about keeping his mind as uncluttered as he would have liked, but he still felt like he should have noticed something as big and important as a memory block. The doctor sighed and forced his attention back to the present and the ongoing conversation. "Had to go back in time to get Donna out. And let me tell you, crossing my own timeline was weird. I thought the doc was going to lock me in the TARDIS when he realized my mom was there," Dean was telling Kaz, and when the doctor focused, he could see that Kaz was frowning deeper and deeper, the more he heard of Dean's story. "If that were the case, I can see why an angel felt the need to step in," Kaz said. He wasn't human, the doctor could see that much easily enough, and he had a way of speaking human words that told those around him that he was measuring each one. "Your fate is vital to the war. Nothing can be allowed to change your past or your future." "There you go again," Dean said, obviously annoyed. "I already told you. Perhaps we can have this argument at a time when your friend is not so near collapse," Kaz suggested, gesturing toward the doctor. No, Don't mind me, the doctor said, waving off the looks that all three of them were now giving him. Go on, you were complimenting my friend while also trying to railroad him into something he clearly doesn't want. That doesn't sound like it'll backfire on you or anything. See, the doc gets it, Dean said triumphantly. No, he really does not, Cause said, narrowing his eyes toward the doctor, though not in anger. No, he was working something out, his head tilted to the side. The doctor could read the body language signs and knew exactly what plotting looked like. Dean waved his hand. Don't listen to Cause, he told Donna. He gets his wings knotted when people mess with the divine plan or whatever. Dean, Cause said in such a tone of long-suffering that the doctor knew instantly that Dean had known better than to be dismissive and did it anyway, just to get a rise out of Cause. Hey, I call it like I see it, Dean said. Dean, Cause said. It really was amazing how simply changing his tone could change the way Dean reacted. The doctor might have been distracted, but even fighting a bad headache, he could see the way Dean straightened up and lost his teasing smile. It wasn't the same way he straightened up when he spoke to or dealt with his father. This was different. This was born out of respect and trust, which in itself was surprising, since Dean Winchester didn't trust easily, and it had sounded like Cause was trying to pressure him into something he didn't want to do. I believe I know what is wrong with your friend. Yeah, so do I, Dean pointed out. Or weren't you listening? Cause smirked, the expression nearly foreign on his face, and looking like he hadn't meant to do it. I somehow doubt that you would like me to heal him by sending him to hell, and then dragging him back. Would you though? No. Didn't think so, Dean said, shaking his head. So start making sense, Cause. I am making sense, you're just being infuriating. All right, boys, you two can find a room later, Donna cut in, shaking her head at Dean and Cause, and apparently shocking them both into silence, which was also telling, for the two of them to have such an easy relationship and not know how it looked. Then again, the number of times he and Donna had been mistaken for a couple. The doctor smirked. Ah well, they'd figure it out. In the meantime, Cause had stationed himself in front of the doctor, frowning hard as he considered what to do before he simply reached forward and placed his hands on either side of the doctor's head. This won't take long, he promised. Bedside manner, Cause. You're supposed to say it won't hurt, Dean said, though he was frowning. What are you doing? Erasing the ties that should never have been there. English, Cause. Cause sighed, but didn't remove his hands from the doctor's head, and for the doctor's part, he didn't pull away either. He could already recognize the posture and the light telepathic touch. Angels, whatever they were, had powers that he could at least recognize among those that he hadn't yet figured out. It means, Cause said, I'm going to rid your friend of the weeping angel's interference. Now, let me concentrate. Cause closed his eyes, and so did the doctor. He could feel the familiar sensation of a mind reaching out to his, and on instinct, he reached out as well, which turned out to be a mistake. As soon as the doctor's mind, filled with war and time itself, met the angelic force filled with obedience and God's plan, the two telepathic presences overwhelmed each other, and an instant later, both Cause and the doctor were unconscious. As an angel of the Lord, there were few things in heaven and earth that could surprise Castiel. Dean Winchester was one of those things. He was a constant puzzle to Castiel, pushing against God's plan when he should have embraced his role. Yes, humans had been put on the earth to be tested, to find their free will, and use it to choose sides, God or the devil. But he had never met anyone who used that precious gift in such a self-defeating way. How it made sense to go against God and expect to win was beyond Castiel's comprehension. And he was an angel. He was supposed to comprehend the mysteries of the world. Yes, Dean Winchester was one of the surprises Castiel had encountered, since he had moved out of a passive role in Earth's affairs into a more active one. That was a given at this point. And now, this Time Lord was a second surprise. In hindsight, Castiel shouldn't have been surprised by the vast knowledge and secrets locked away inside the mind of a Time Lord. While Castiel knew much about heaven and earth, heaven only had jurisdiction over humanity. Other species had their own heavens and hells, their own gods, their own beliefs. And so, there was no reason for an angel to know anything about other life forms, except when they crossed humanity. The angels as a whole knew of the doctor, of course. He had interfered in Earth's affairs often enough to be a known entity. He wasn't considered dangerous. Not really, because his interference often led to Earth's liberation from outside forces. He was, however, considered to have the potential for danger, especially since he had an affinity for humanity that could get in the way of the plans for the apocalypse. However, it was one thing to know of someone and another thing entirely to know someone. The first thing Castiel was struck by was the pure despair he could feel emanating from the doctor. It permeated every inch of his consciousness, an awareness of his guilt in destroying his people, a heaviness when he thought of the war he had seen, and the loss he had endured. That despair seeped into every piece of the doctor's being, influencing his decisions. It occurred to Castiel in that moment that such a being would oppose the end of the world with every fiber of his being, refusing to lose one more home, even if it was not the place where he'd been born. And this would be a problem. And yet Castiel couldn't help but sympathize. It was completely understandable that the doctor would feel this way, and it made perfect sense that Dean would be friends with this alien. Castiel could only hope that the doctor wouldn't turn around and infect Dean even more with an anti-apocalypse outlook. Castiel already had his work cut out for him, after all. At the same time that Castiel was flooded with the doctor's essence, he could feel his own essence similarly flooding the doctor. His long life, his knowledge of his purpose, of God's plan. Perhaps the doctor could learn something from that and help win Dean over. If he could only see that this was what was best for the world. But then, that would be a miracle. Finally, Castiel was able to focus through the fog of being lost in the doctor's essence, to remember what he was there for. The centuries that had stretched before him and the ramifications of the doctor's positions had distracted him, and that on its own was enough to surprise Castiel. He was an angel, he was supposed to be perfect. Castiel really was getting too distracted by Dean Winchester and his ongoing stubbornness. It was becoming a problem. He pushed aside his peripheral concerns and instead focused on combing the doctor's consciousness for the source of the problem. The temptation to explore the doctor's mind was strong, but he was an angel. He wasn't supposed to be tempted, and besides, he had already indulged himself long enough. If he had truly kept himself unspotted from temptation, he would have gone right to the problem without even the briefest pause of exploration. Earth and the Winchesters were making him soft, that much was increasingly clear. And that simple fact bothered him more than Castiel could say. Still, he knew he would lose the Winchesters' trust entirely if he didn't do anything to help the doctor, so he pressed forward until he found the weeping angel's presence in the doctor's mind. It was subtle and well contained, and he couldn't help but smile when he saw the telepathic protections in place. He recognized instantly what angel had stepped in to save the doctor's mind. No one but Deborah did work like that. It had been a long time since Castiel had seen any sign of Deborah. She had chosen to fall years ago, which was not very long in the lifespan of an angel, but long enough to grow into a person with their own ideas and choices and beliefs in human years. Because she was fallen, he wasn't supposed to look for her, but he had always wondered what had happened, what had made her decide to fall. When they were so close to the final victory, seeing her fingerprints in the doctor's mind, though, and hearing the story Dean had to tell about what had happened with the weeping angels, Castiel was starting to get an idea of what had happened. The Winchesters were a force unto themselves, and so was the doctor. Both at once to an angel who didn't have enough background to resist the temptation well. Castiel could understand it. He'd felt the same temptation, the same desire for choice. Not that he approved of falling, of course, but he was coming to understand it a little better. He pushed aside thoughts of Deborah and falling, and traced over her work in the doctor's mind. Her miracle was excellent, it had just cast too wide a net. The weeping angel was escaping because there were too many other memories tied up in the adventure the doctor had shared with Dean. She couldn't have hoped to keep all of those memories contained at once. This would have been easier if the doctor had simply regenerated, because the process would purge the weeping angel as well. But Castiel had come to expect that every task on Earth would be more difficult than necessary. Earth was like that. But he didn't have to worry about an entirely new miracle, so he could instead refine the focus on Deborah's. That would also work. Castiel concentrated until Deborah's careful handiwork was concentrated only on the weeping angel itself, not on the memories associated with it. It was hard work, and he felt drained and exhausted after the fact, but the angel was contained better than it had been before, anyway. He was too tired to look around the doctor's mind anymore either, so he backed out of the telepathic connection, even taking a few steps back in the physical world, as he recovered his senses, and nearly backed into Dean. "Whoa, hey cuz," Dean said, catching him at the elbow. "You alright?" In an unguarded moment, Castiel almost smiled at the simple gesture of concern and care. Humans could be so multifaceted. Dean in particular. He could go from fighting to gentleness in the blink of an eye. Maybe that was why Castiel was so fascinated by him. "I'm fine," Castiel said, straightening up. "The doctor's mind is simply a maze." "I could have told you that," Dean said, though he still looked concerned as he glanced between the doctor and Castiel. "So what's the story?" I fixed the shield he had before, Castiel explained. He should be able to remember all of it freely. He simply won't remember the immediate reason for what happened, namely, that the weeping angel entered his mind. He'll understand it as an infection, nothing more. Donna frowned. Are you sure? He'll be fine, Castiel said, even as the doctor reached out to put a hand on Donna's arm, confirming what Castiel was saying. But he was tired, and he needed some space to think about everything he had seen, and to consider what he would even say to his superiors that wouldn't bring some calamity down on the people in Alien before him. So, he let out a breath, tipped his chin up, and simply vanished before anyone could ask him any more questions. So it's always like this with you, isn't it? Donna was watching the spot where Dean's friend Castiel had disappeared, shaking her head at the situation. She hadn't specified which of the men she was talking to, but they both seemed to think she was addressing them. Pretty much, Dean said. It seems to be the case, the doctor said, rubbing his forehead with a distracted look on his face. Dean and the doctor both glanced at each other and smirked before Dean asked, "How you feeling?" "Everything seems to be working," the doctor assured him, even going so far as to move his arms and legs, as if that was any kind of reassurance when the problem had been with his head. "Other than a lingering psychic headache from the feedback of your friend's telepathic touch, I think I'll live." "What did he do, anyway?" Dean asked, offering the doctor a hand up. "Oh, the psychic equivalent of a good old-fashioned tune-up," the doctor said easily. "One part starts acting up, the light flashes, and dang, Bob's your uncle. You've got an angel in your head with a telepathic screwdriver to see what the problem is." "I don't think that explained anything at all," Dean said dryly. Donna laughed. "He likes to think he's so clever by talking in circles." "Oh, is that why he and Sammy get along so well?" Dean asked in mock surprise. Then, when the doctor gave both of them a dry look and an oi, Dean grinned over at him. "Seriously, what happened?" "A meeting of the minds," the doctor said. "Literally. Your friend and I met on the psychic plane, took stock of each other, and then he found where the problem was, and erected shiny new barriers to contain whatever's in there." He tapped the side of his head. "I've had worse in there, believe you me." "Why does this not surprise me?" Donna said dryly. It seemed like every time the doctor revealed something about himself, it was some new mystery or trauma. The guy needed about 900 years of therapy, in her opinion, but traveling time and space and saving people seemed to work just as well, so she wasn't going to complain. "Actually," the doctor said, looking toward Dean, "I learned a few interesting things about your angelic friend while we were sharing each other's thoughts." Dean leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with interest. "Oh!" Donna only barely kept back her delighted smile and the laugh that wanted to come with it. Better to let Dean figure this out on her own, she figured, even if his interest in more than just a professional sense was written all over his face. "Spill, doctor," she ordered. The doctor met Donna's gaze with only a whisper of the smirk that she expected from him, since she was fairly certain he could see the same obvious interest she could, and then looked back to Dean, perfectly serious. "You're welcome to join me and Donna," he said. "Let heaven and hell or whatever they want to call their respective dimensions fight their war some other way with some other vessel." He said that last word with revulsion, his features twisting. "Sam's welcome aboard too, you know." Donna frowned, losing her good mood entirely. She should have known that Dean would find someone to interest him who was only interested in using him in return. She didn't have the whole story yet, but the way the doctor said vessel had her already considering pounding Castiel the next time she saw him. The truth was, she was more than a little protective of Dean, and had been ever since she'd met him when he was so young she was his babysitter. It seemed like every time she met him, he'd found some new way to get beaten down, and she was starting to get sick of it. She was honestly worried that he was going to end up like the doctor, full of a quiet rage that spilled out despite his best efforts. And since Donna didn't see Sam around, she knew she had to tell Dean the same thing she'd told the doctor on too many occasions. "You don't need to be alone." Both Dean and the doctor turned to face Donna, and Donna quickly realized that she hadn't actually articulated her train of thought. She must have sounded like she was offering Dean reasons to stay aboard the TARDIS, though now that she thought of it, she wouldn't mind being there for him. She just wondered if she'd be able to keep up looking after two high-maintenance boys. "I do all right," Dean assured her with a cocky, crooked smile. "Plus, I've usually got Sam around. I don't actually need a babysitter," he added, and she couldn't help but smirk at his teasing tone. "Not what I was proposing," she shot back. "Or propositioning." Donna laughed at the suggestive way Dean waggled his eyebrows, and then at the look of intense long-suffering on the doctor's face. "Flirt." "Was it a no?" Dean pointed out. "Stop it," the doctor said in a warning tone, but Dean's smile only grew. "Heard that before." "Then you'd think you'd be used to it." I am. You'd think you'd be used to it, Dean shot back without missing a beat. He's got you there, Donna agreed, not even bothering to hide her laughter. Every time she and the doctor met up with Dean, she was further and further convinced that having him aboard the TARDIS would be the definition of fun. Not many people could keep up with the doctor she knew from experience, and it was always fun watching people take him down a peg. Or 20. The doctor shook his head before he turned to Dean, meeting Dean's gaze, so Dean could understand how serious he was. I mean it. I'm sure the TARDIS can figure out how to avoid extra-dimensional beings bent on bringing Armageddon to your world. Should be simple enough for her, actually, and it could save you and your brother a lot of heartache. Dean tipped his head to the side and narrowed his eyes, a sure sign that he was actually considering the doctor's offer, and not just confidently brushing it aside. Even Donna could see the intense concern in the doctor's eyes, and he was looking at Dean, not her. That kind of care could get anyone thinking. Still, even Donna could have predicted Dean's answer. I can't go anywhere without Sam. I wouldn't expect anything less. The offer has always been for both of you to come with me, the doctor said evenly. Where is he? We were on a hunt before Kaz showed up and zapped me somewhere else to talk. He's doing some research, shouldn't take too long for me to find him again. Dean held up his cell phone. You mind? Not at all, the doctor said, gesturing for Dean to do what he needed to do. Donna watched Dean leave, and waited for him to get into what looked like an animated conversation with Sam, before she slid over to the doctor, both eyebrows high on her head. So are you going to tell me what's going on or not, spaceman? The doctor pressed his lips together, let out his breath, and then nodded once, sharply. Castiel and the other angels are trying to convince Dean to let them use his body, so they can fill it with their leader, and fight a war between heaven and hell. Sam is being recruited for the other side. It's an invasion in every sense of the word, privacy, autonomy, you name it. And they're trying to dress it up like it's all inevitable, and the boys should just let it happen. Donna pulled a horrible face. You're right, she said. Let's kidnap them. The doctor laughed outright. Oh, is that what we're doing? Isn't it? The doctor laughed again and then gestured with one hand toward Dean. Let's just see what he says, shall we? As soon as Sam saw the big blue police box on the horizon, he started to shake his head, though he didn't say anything until he had caught up to Dean and shoved his brother in the shoulder. I should have known you'd find trouble as soon as I turned my back. Yes, because of the two of us, I'm the high-maintenance one, Dean shot right back, shoving Sam at the shoulder as well. You look like crap, by the way. That's what happens when your brother ditches you in the middle of a hunt. That doesn't sound like something I'd do. Sure, Dean smirked, but now that they'd gotten the hellos more or less out of the way, Sam could see the shift in his brother, as he tipped his head toward the doctor and Donna, who were both grinning as they watched the two of them interacting. So, Dean said, dropping his voice to something softer and more serious, what do you think? I think it's not the first time he's offered. I know. And I think if it was that simple, someone would have stepped in to keep us far away from the guy by now, Sam continued. Dean raised an eyebrow and then pointed toward his own head. Someone like an angel who erased my memories of the last time the doc and I ran into angels? Doesn't count, Sam said without missing a beat. He and Dean had already had this argument anyway, but it was easier to tease his brother than to discuss in front of the doctor and Donna whether they'd stick around. If they did that, then their audience would try to have input, and the Winchester brothers didn't make decisions for anybody but themselves. Sure, Sammy. Sam smirked, then tipped his head toward the doctor. He's not going to take it well, you know. Neither is Donna. Yeah, your babysitter is protective, Sam teased. Kinda nice to have a sexy protective babysitter all my own when I'm old enough to do something about it. Huh, Dean said, grinning wider and wider with every single word. Seriously, Dean, like you weren't thinking it. I wasn't. Your loss, then. Sam shook his head as he turned back to the doctor and Donna, who were respectfully letting the two of them have their teasing conversation, without trying to push them into a decision, even if the doctor was bouncing on the balls of his feet, switching which foot he was putting the most weight on with every movement. Sam wasn't sure how he felt about the doctor's obvious nerves. On the one hand, it was nice to see him caring enough to not only make the offer of travel, but put forth that kind of emotional energy. On the other, it was such a stark difference to the doctor's response to Dean's deal with hell, that Sam didn't trust it. It didn't matter to him that Dean had come back. The doctor had still refused to help them avoid his death in the first place. Hell had changed Dean. There was no denying it. And while Sam was aware of all the changes he'd been through, as he drifted closer and closer to hell and his own destiny he was trying to fight, he wanted to shield his brother from what had happened. Dean had already been through enough. He shouldn't have been forced to suffer in hell. Before Sam had met an angel, he'd believed in a fair and just God, and he hadn't been able to reconcile that belief with what had happened to his big brother. Now, he didn't know what he believed anymore, but he knew he believed anyone who had stood aside to let Dean go to hell didn't deserve his respect, let alone his friendship. So, he didn't bother to censor himself as he asked the doctor outright. What changed? As expected, the doctor stopped all motion and blinked at Sam a few times, obviously trying to place the question in context. He asked at last, a sound that didn't acknowledge anything when he was waiting for Sam to lay out his cards. Sam shook his head as he gestured to his brother. You wouldn't help us before. You said everything was set in stone. And now you're parading around telling us we shouldn't be shoehorned into our destiny. Seems hypocritical. The doctor's shoulders fell. I know it looks that way from the outside, he said gently, but Sam already didn't appreciate his tone. It doesn't just look that way. The doctor took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I can see it, he explained, still using the same tone of voice that had Sam even more on edge than before. I can see all the possibilities in time. I can see what can be changed and what can't, which moments are fixed moments, and which ones are fluid. That's crap. Sam crossed his arms as the doctor raised an eyebrow. It is. You really mean to tell me that my brother dying is a fixed point in time, but the end of the world isn't? To Sam's surprise, the doctor drew himself up taller, his eyes flashing with the power that he always tried to contain, but never quite managed. Don't tell me a Winchester is admitting defeat to that feathery excuse for a supernatural being, the doctor said, his voice soft but dangerous. I've seen the end of the world, Sam Winchester, and it does not end, because some powerful beings thought Earth would be the right playground for a turf war. Before Sam could say anything, Dean cut in. You know, that's actually comforting, he said. Kind of like concrete proof that we're right. But you just said that time can be fluid, Sam pointed out. He'd had enough of false hopes to last him a lifetime. He wasn't going to believe that he could outrun the destiny the world was trying to shove into his hands, just because the doctor said it was possible. Yes, I did, and I see where you're going for this, but that's not the point of what I'm trying to tell you, the doctor said, both eyebrows raised with his hands out in front of him, gesturing with nearly every word. I saw the world being overtaken by your son. It was the first star Rose and I went together, the doctor said, pausing just long enough that literally everyone could see the stricken expression on his face. And yeah, Sam didn't like the doctor, didn't trust him as far as he could throw him. But if there was one thing that stayed consistent over everything he'd seen about the guy, everything he knew, it was this. The doctor wouldn't invoke Rose's name for no good reason. So, with a sigh, Sam let his shoulders drop and nodded almost imperceptibly. Let's start with one trip, just so we can hear you out. I'm not promising anything more. The doctor lit up with a grin and clapped his hands together. Well then, come on, boys and Donna, we've got the whole of time to find something fun to do. Geez, Doc, what do you do when you're not trying to impress someone? The doctor grinned wildly as he stepped backwards out of the TARDIS, so he could watch the expressions on his companions' faces. This was the best part. This was always the best part. This was why he traveled with friends. The look of awe. The universe was wonder and hope and terror all wrapped up in a bow, waiting for someone to tear it open and find out what was inside, like a cosmic Christmas morning every time he walked out the doors of the TARDIS. And sharing that feeling with others was what made Christmas, or what made exploration. Or, he'd lost track of the metaphor somewhere. But the point was that the universe was amazing, and he loved to see people realize it. He'd asked the TARDIS to find something memorable. Something that, if no logical arguments would appeal to the Winchesters, would have to be enough to get them hooked. He had seen it when they were boys and could see it now. They both had the itch, the unstoppable urge to keep moving, keep finding the next adventure. And they could do better for an adventure than transdimensional beings claiming to be angels and demons. So, the TARDIS has taken them to the planet Demeter, a planet whose orbit around its sun lined up with its planetary rotation, so that one side was in perpetual darkness, and the other in perpetual light. The side facing the sun was a popular tourist destination, full of leisure palaces with pools and people working on tans. But the dark side was just as breathtaking. They call it Demeter, the doctor explained. One side for winter and one side for summer. Both of the Winchesters nodded, though they weren't looking around the planet or its perfectly formed ice mountains. They were looking up at the sky, and for good reason. The doctor's grin got somehow wider as he followed their gaze, his hands in his pockets. All four of them stared up at the nebula above their heads, shining brilliant blues and purples across the perpetual night sky. The complete lack of light pollution meant the nebula looked even closer than it actually was, and every star in the sky looked slightly violet because of how purple the sky was. Persephone's nebula, the doctor said, still looking up at it alongside the others. Demeter is always looking up at her daughter, never touching her in her winter of longing. Poetic, Sam said without looking away from the light show in the sky. Even someone who had come determined not to change his mind had to stop and stare at the wonder of the infinite. The doctor smiled and looked around at his companions. The Winchesters were a matched set, with quiet grins and their hands in their pockets, while Donna was louder about her grin, as she hit the doctor with the back of her hand, as if to tell him he wasn't as impressive as what she could see. She kept him on his toes that way. Yes, she had the same awe that he loved to see, but she reminded him that he wasn't part of the universe's majesty. And yes, sometimes he needed that reminder. Seriously, Dean breathed out. Is it like this every time? Yes, Donna put in, grinning. Yes, it is. And then there's lots of running, too. That's the fun part, Dean pointed out. Of course you'd think so, Donna laughed. And you don't, Dean challenged. What made you start traveling with him? Huh, you get that high when you save someone, right? When you've been through hell and come out the other side dragging someone else out of the flames too. Something in Dean's expression had shifted, though the doctor didn't think he was aware of it. Because when you're not with him, you don't always get those better endings, right? Donna's expression fell as she watched Dean. I don't think we're having the same conversation anymore, she said in a tone that the doctor had only ever seen her use with Dean. Something about having helped raise him when he was too young to remember her well turned her softer. Dean shrugged, trying to look careless. Metaphor was wrong, that's all. Ooh, right. Demons and angels and all that. Donna made a face. No thank you. Every time I run into one, including the spacey kind, he ends up moping for days. She gestured toward the doctor, who scoffed and drew himself up. I don't mope. You do, Donna insisted. You do, and then you try to find someplace exciting to take your mind off of things, and then we end up in Pompeii. Pompeii? Sam repeated, finally joining the conversation and looking like he couldn't help but be interested in such a big part of history. You took her to Pompeii? In my defense, I was aiming for Rome. Aim was a little off there, Doc Dean laughed. It always is, Donna said. He only says he knows what he's doing. But really, he's just flinging himself around the universe in his big wooden box, and hoping he sticks somewhere fun. Hey, the doctor protested. You just said that all our trips are as brilliant as this one. He gestured toward the view they'd all been enjoying just moments ago. And I also said that they involved a lot of running, Donna said, her eyes sparkling as she looked toward Dean. Poor thing needs constant reassurance. It's a big job, Dean agreed, and his grin was so wide that the doctor didn't have the heart to tell them to stop it. The Winchesters seemed to have lost so much of the light that the doctor had seen in them when they were little boys, and that light only got dimmer with age. That was true of most humans, but with Dean and Sam, it was different. Distressing. So, yes, the doctor was willing to be the pinata, so long as some of that joy came back. But while Dean was laughing easily, something else was going on just behind Sam's eyes. The doctor wasn't sure what it was until Sam spoke up. So you're not always 100% sure where you'll end up. That fits what I've heard about you. When the doctor turned Sam's way, Dean spoke up in the protective but proud tone that the doctor had heard even when they were kids. That's Sam. Always doing research. For good reason, Sam pointed out, though he was still looking toward the doctor. And I'm getting pretty good at recognizing when something is all flash and temptation but no guarantees. The doctor nearly lost a step. That's not a fair comparison, he spluttered, unable to come up with a witty retort when he knew what Sam was referencing. Sure, Sam said flatly, but without dropping the doctor's gaze. Okay, Dean said, stepping in between the two of them. I think he gets the point, Sammy. Then, he turned to give the doctor more of his attention. He's not wrong, you know. You want to run away from the problem and hope you don't ever end up on Earth again, where we'd be within reach of angels and demons, and hope that their influence doesn't spread beyond Earth. That's a lot to stake a retreat on. The doctor sighed and let his shoulders drop, disappointed, but not entirely surprised by the boy's outlooks. And the Winchesters don't know the meaning of retreat. Hey, Dean said, one finger pointed at the doctor's chest. We don't run from fights and leave other people to clean up the mess. These guys, these angels and demons, they'll do anything to get the fight they want. And if we're the ones they're after, that means we're the ones that can throw a monkey wrench right in the middle of their plans for the apocalypse. He smiled grimly. They picked the wrong family to mess with. A tactical retreat would be. Doc, Dean cut in with a sharp look that told the doctor exactly how close the conversation was. The doctor sighed, then set his shoulders, all at once deciding that he wasn't going to fight them this time. Right then, he said, striding forward, if we're here to sightsee, I say let's get a closer look. Dean had gone back in the TARDIS well before the others, not because he was ready to go back to Earth and face the relentless pushiness of the angels, or the constant dread that came with the demons hounding Sam, but because he missed the TARDIS itself. Once upon a time, he'd actually driven the TARDIS. It hadn't been pretty or controlled or well. He couldn't really claim that he'd been the one driving, if he was honest, but he had a connection with the TARDIS. He liked spending time at the console. Besides, all things considered, he was facing the end of the world. Even if the doctor had seen the actual end and Dean knew that meant they were going to stop this crazy apocalypse, Dean fully expected that they were going to suffer losses. And he knew if he had to, he'd die before he let anything happen to Sam. So, he said quietly, running a hand on the edge of the console, smiling at the familiarity, I guess this is goodbye. The TARDIS couldn't speak, not in real words, anyway, but Dean knew, somehow, that the deep clanging that echoed the console room was a gentle but chiding response, as if the TARDIS was telling him that this wasn't really goodbye. Yeah, I'm sure you'll meet me again in your future. Already seen the next Doctor, actually. Get ready for a redesign. The TARDIS dinged indignantly. Dean chuckled. No, it's awesome. You'll like it, I promise. Another ding, and Dean laughed again. No, I'm not lying. Why are you like this? As the TARDIS rang out with something like laughter in the way its sounds echoed, Donna stepped into the TARDIS as well, leaning against the doorframe with a crooked smile. Should I leave the two of you alone? She asked. Dean smirked and gestured to the TARDIS. We're old friends. I can see that. Donna shook her head and then stepped inside, closing the door behind her and thumbing over her shoulder. They're having a row. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Sam can hold a grudge when he wants to, Dean said, his hands in his pockets as he leaned against the console. So can the doctor, Donna said. Really? This one doesn't seem the type, Dean said, thinking back on all the times he'd met this incarnation of the doctor. Then again, he'd met him for the first time when he was a kid, so that might have colored things just a little bit. Remind me to tell you the story of how we met, Donna said in a sigh as she came to join him leaned against the console. Dean smirked and only waited as long as it took Donna to look his way again, before he broke into a grin outright. Hey, Donna, tell me the story of how you met. Donna let out a scoffing breath and pushed him at the shoulder. You haven't changed at all from when I stayed with you in Kansas. You were asking for it, Dean said, still grinning. I should have known better, Donna laughed. Dean watched Donna and her bright smile before he took a step forward. Hey, for the record, sexiest babysitter I know. Donna's smile turned more crooked before she held up a hand between them. Whoa there, that is the pickup line you went with? You're the one comparing me to my toddler self. You're the one in a hurry to repeat your streaking performance. Results would be better this time around, I guarantee. Donna laughed but shook her head all the same. No, Dean. Then, with some of the light out of her expression, she added, maybe ask me again when it doesn't feel like you're trying for goodbye sex. Dean opened and then closed his mouth. Yeah, he should have known that Donna would see through what he was doing. That was the problem with having a crush on someone who had known you literally your whole life. They had an unfair advantage. Never know, he said, trying to regain the knowing smirk he'd had before. Life of a time traveler. You never know, Donna agreed. She leaned against the TARDIS. You know, she said slowly, you're too much like him sometimes. Who, Sam? Dean scoffed. Yeah, right? He wishes. No, the doctor. Donna watched as Dean lost his ability to form words and smiled to herself. Dean knew that she knew how much Dean looked up to the doctor. He couldn't help his childhood heroes. Add in his childhood babysitter and man, did he need to work on his poker face. You're both terrible when you try to go it alone. Neither of you have a lick of self-preservation, and you're absolute idiots in the best and worst ways. You know that, right? Dean blinked at her and then sucked in his breath through his teeth. He had to find a way to turn this conversation around, or it was going to go in all the directions he didn't want it to go. So, once he let out all his breath again, he said, so, should I be worried about the doctor? Because I've met the future version of him, so I know he's not going anywhere permanently. But the way you're talking about him, I mean, I'm totally fine. You're probably just projecting. Of course you're fine, Donna said in a tone that said she absolutely didn't believe him. You two really are the same person. He'll be happy to hear you complimenting him. Huh. Donna shook her head, rolled her eyes, and then reached out to grab his arm and yank him over to her in a hug. It wasn't the least bit sexual either, and he knew it. This was all warmth and the kind of love that came from knowing each other for so long. And it seemed like she needed it. So he didn't make any effort to get out of it. That wouldn't be fair to her. When Donna finally let up on the hug, Dean stepped back and cleared his throat. So, he said and cleared his throat. Have you met any Silurians yet? Donna let out a scoff of a laugh. What? Oh, you haven't met the lizard people at the center of the earth? Are you pulling my leg? She shot back, drawing herself up for a fight if he was. He grinned crookedly and threw his arm around her shoulders. Donna, he said, dipping his head to catch her gaze, buckle in. Have I got a story for you? With that, he pulled her over to find somewhere to sit. This was a much easier conversation to have. The TARDIS was in flight, but other than the noises the TARDIS itself was making, things were quiet. And when the Doctor was traveling with Donna, that level of silence was too much to ignore. So, he vaulted over the railing and landed next to her, bumping her shoulder with his and wearing his best grin. When she didn't smile back, though, he dropped that but stayed with his shoulder touching hers. You alright? Yeah, she said in a tone he recognized too well because he used it himself all the time. He bit his lip, then nodded to himself and jumped to his feet again, going to the console to look for yes, there it was. Donna, they're going to be fine, he said, turning the screen, so she could see the message displayed there. He'd received it ages ago, before he even knew who Dean and Sam were, and he'd archived it for later, when he had more context for what was going on. Maybe it made him vain, but he kept every one of the thank you notes that he'd ever gotten, because he felt sometimes that he did so much damage that he needed the reminder, every reminder he could, that he was capable of doing some good too. And as was the nature of being a time traveler, sometimes he got thank you notes for things he hadn't yet done. And that only made him more determined to find whoever it was that had needed his help and get them whatever they needed. And there it was, written across the screen. Thanks for the help, Dean. Donna gestured at the message. You're going to have to connect the dots for me, spaceman. So he said thank you. Nice of him, but this was sent from the year 5,357,491,003. The Doctor explained, grinning steadily wider, as he saw the realization crossed on his face. I don't know what that means for them, but sometime in their distant future, or maybe sooner than that, they're going to be light years away, billions of years in their own futures. Donna's slow smile turned into a grin, and then, she reached over to slug the Doctor in the shoulder. Ow! Why didn't you tell me? She demanded. I've been all worked up and you've just been letting it happen. Because I didn't want. Look, Donna, there are a few fixed points in time, and from what I just saw, those boys are headed toward one now, and I don't want to enter. Yeah, non-interference of the Time Lords, blah blah blah. You still should have told me, Donna insisted with her hands on her hips. Alright, he said, smiling as he held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Alright, you're right, I should have told you. Donna glared at him for a good, long time, until she finally let out a loud sigh, and gestured with one hand toward the screen. So, what else aren't you telling me? Huh. The Doctor laughed. Donna, this isn't a secret. You can't tell me you haven't kept letters and notes before. Donna tried to keep looking angry, she really did, but slowly, almost without her permission, a smile started to stretch across her face, and she shook her head at him. You big softy, she said, obvious affection ringing in her tone. The Doctor chuckled despite himself. No need to act so surprised. I do have two hearts, he teased. And it makes you a big softy, Donna agreed. She socked him lightly in the shoulder, and then gestured at the message again. Should we drop in on them, then? Do you want to? Donna nodded, one eyebrow raised at him, giving him the look she always reserved for the moment she thought he was being too ridiculous for her to deal with him. All right, he said, running his hands down the console. What do you think? He asked the TARDIS, smiling when he could feel the thrum underneath his hands. That always meant she was responding to him. Wait a minute, Donna said, holding up both hands. Let me find something different to wear. Where are we going, anyway? The Doctor glanced over the readout and shook his head, smirking. Of course that's where he'd go as soon as he gets the run of the universe. Looks like a leisure planet, he said. So dress for a vacation. Got it, Donna said, already disappearing down the hallway, leaving the Doctor alone in the console room again. He leaned back and ran his hand down his face, and heard the TARDIS ding in response to how bone-deep exhausted he felt. He patted her gently. I know, he said. But if I didn't get attached, if I didn't love them, what would be the point of all this? Huh. The TARDIS hummed back at him, and he chuckled. Oh, don't act like you aren't just as invested. You're the one who started keeping those thank you notes, aren't you? The TARDIS dinged, and he laughed again. Oh, sure, you were keeping them for my benefit. He patted the console. Love you too, old girl. The console room filled itself with a warmth that Donna wouldn't have been able to feel with her human senses, a telepathic warmth that felt more like a hug than anything else. Though it wasn't quite that either, but it was meant for him, and it came from the TARDIS, and that was what mattered. The name for the sensation didn't mean anything. When Donna came back, looking like she was ready for a day at the beach, the doctor grinned her way and waved her over. You look lovely, he promised. She shook her head at him good-naturedly. Don't I always? He chuckled. Oh, obviously, he agreed as the TARDIS came to a shuddering stop. He patted the console and then headed for the door, and then immediately sighed when he saw where they were. What's wrong? Donna asked. That's not a good look. Are they in trouble again, or? The doctor shook his head quickly. No, it's nothing like that, he promised. He sighed, dragged his hand down his face, and explained. This is the wrong leisure planet. Donna let out an exasperated sound from the back of her throat, and hit him with the back of her hand. I thought you knew how to fly this thing. I do. He defended himself quickly. Donna gestured out of the TARDIS, both eyebrows raised. Doesn't look like it, spaceman. The doctor shrugged, shoving both of his hands into his long coat. If you don't want to stay here. I didn't say that, Donna said, and the doctor chuckled at her. You said we can still vacation here, right? Like I can stop you. He laughed, opening the doors to the TARDIS with a flourish. Donna peeked out and grinned at the shimmering glass that filtered the bright sunlight. At the pool she could already see past the concierge desk. At the advertisements for a waterfall that tourists could come see. She tipped her head at one of the advertising posters. Midnight, huh? Ever been before? The doctor shook his head, grinning steadily wider at the thought of something new. Nope, should be fun. There were still mornings when Dean genuinely couldn't make himself get out of bed. The longer it had been since Sam had died, the fewer mornings he had like that. It got easier with Lisa and Ben there. It was nice to have someone to reach for when he first woke up, and the memories were still clinging to him like a bad hangover. It helped to have someone there relying on him. It gave him a reason to get up, no matter how badly he wanted to linger in those memories, when memories were all he had left of Sam. He debated staying in bed for a while longer. It was a Sunday. He didn't have anywhere he needed to be. Plenty of people took lazy Sundays to themselves, right? This was a perfectly normal thing to want as part of the picket fence life he'd promised he'd live. Except he was trying not to give himself permission to laze around too much. Because if he did, he flat out wouldn't get up most days. And besides, he'd promised to mow the lawn while the weather was good. It was supposed to storm for the next 6 days straight, so he wouldn't have time to do it any other day. And if he wanted to beat the summer heat, he needed to get out early. So, he stretched and then leaned over to kiss Lisa's cheek, while she was still sleeping. When she smiled and turned into him in her sleep, he couldn't help but smile as well. He was getting used to this life, out of old habit. He checked Ben's room as he passed and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, and he checked some of the protections he had set up all around the house. It gave him a little peace of mind, even if things had been quiet since he moved into the neighborhood. The last thing he wanted to do was bring down his kind of trouble on a perfectly good family. But everything seemed to be okay. So once he had walked the perimeter, he put in some headphones and got to work. His neighbor to the right had just gotten a riding lawnmower, and he'd talked to Dean about how much easier it was. But for Dean, there was something relaxing about pushing the mower himself. He'd given up the hunter lifestyle, sure, but there was a part of him that didn't want to get too relaxed, too out of shape. It wasn't just vanity either. There was just a little thought in the back of his mind, something that said he wasn't ever going to get to relax, not really. He figured that would go away eventually, once he'd lived the quiet life long enough to be sure that it was actually going to be quiet. Maybe he'd be able to let go of some of the habits that had kept him alive in a different, louder life. He was just finishing up the front yard when he saw an unfamiliar car park outside the neighbor's house. The couple that stepped out looked like honest-to-God movie stars, tall and slender and obviously artificial. There was something about their faces that said they'd had work done. They looked unnatural in a way that instantly had Dean's attention. Old habits died hard. They stopped and talked to the neighbors at the front door, who greeted them warmly. From what Dean could tell with his rudimentary lip-reading skills while he was mowing and trying not to look too much like he was eavesdropping, the unnatural couple had met the neighbors at a school fundraiser, and they'd decided to get together for a friendly breakfast. At least, that was what he had gleaned from such context clues as school, pancakes, and finally, which were relatively easy to lip read from a distance. Dean watched for a while longer, until the door closed behind them, and tried not to think too hard about it. It was probably fine, right? He watched the neighbor's front door for a while longer before he decided on a plan of action. He knew he couldn't just let the matter drop, but he didn't want to go overboard with his paranoia. He didn't want to drag his old life into this new one. So, if he didn't see the neighbors even in the windows by the time he was done out in the yard, he'd go check on them. Nothing wrong with being neighborly, right? Yeah, sooner or later, he was going to have to learn how to be normal. He definitely wasn't good at it yet, and he wasn't sure he would ever be. Still, he sighed and turned his music back on, keeping half an eye on the neighbors as he worked. He did see them moving around the kitchen. Their window looked out toward his lawn, so that was encouraging. After a while, he finished mowing, and the neighbors took their guests outside, while Dean finished up by pulling weeds, feeling almost silly for overthinking things, as he nodded his head along to the old AC/DC song. The love that I want. It's your love that I need. It's your love, got to have. It's your love. What's next to the moon? Moving round the skies. Oh, baby, say bye-bye. You're right next to the moon. And on the moon. Oh, I've been around the moon. He finished what he was doing and pulled his headphones off, yanking his work gloves off to then wave toward his neighbors with one in his hand. They waved back, not overly friendly, since he was still relatively new to the neighborhood, but congenial. But it was the visitors, the ones who looked unnatural, who waved Dean over, beaming at him. And Dean was honestly too curious by that point to turn them down. A little small talk wouldn't kill him, right? The TARDIS sounded empty lately, even though the doctor was trying desperately not to notice. He had honestly expected to find someone new to travel with him by that point, because he always had been able to find someone. The TARDIS didn't like to be lonely any more than he did. He could feel that much just by walking through her hallways. He had noticed lately that she seemed almost nostalgic, that a few old companions' rooms seemed a little closer to his than they usually were, that he'd catch the occasional scent of celery or find a recorder lying around. We're getting old, aren't we, old girl? The doctor said as he rested his hand on her console, and he knew it was the truth. He was older than he'd even told anyone, really. He'd told Rose he was 900 when they met because it was a nice, even number, and he'd counted his age in years since knowing her, though he kept losing track when he traveled without a companion. And yet, despite the melancholy spreading through the TARDIS, the doctor had absolutely noticed that his old girl seemed to be taking him places specifically where he wouldn't take anyone back with him. He kept returning from his adventures alone, ever since he'd been told he was going to die soon. He almost felt betrayed, knowing that the TARDIS believed that prophecy. But then, he believed it too, even if he didn't want to. So he couldn't really blame her for feeling a little bit down, all things considered. Come on, old girl, you're not getting rid of me that easily, he teased as he yanked on the controls of the TARDIS. We're not ready to say goodbye, are we? Got too much to do, too many people to save. And what's the point of living this long just to throw in the towel? Eh? He grinned as widely as he could. What do you say? Who should we save today? With that, he let the TARDIS go and grabbed the side of the console, hanging on through the typical bumpy landing, and grinning the whole time, because it sure sounded like the old girl had a bit of her spark back. To his surprise, however, when he opened the door, he found himself on what looked like a pleasant Sunday afternoon in the middle of an American suburb. The big lawns, the occasional yard sign advertising that the home was for sale or celebrating a school team, the one house with a truck in the yard, and a larger-than-life American flag. The doctor raised an eyebrow and popped his head back into the TARDIS. "You took me to a lazy Sunday?" he asked incredulously. The TARDIS dinged indignantly in response. "I do trust you," he promised her quickly, and when she dinged again, he huffed affectionately, waved her off, and closed the door behind him. "Look, see, I'm braving suburbia for you. If that's not complete and total trust, I don't know what more you want from me." He was still chuckling to himself as he made his way down the street, with his hands shoved deeply in the pockets of his long coat. So far, he didn't see anything amiss. He even saw someone waving to him while pushing a lawnmower. And then, he did a double take. "Dean," the doctor laughed as he walked over to the edge of the fence, and Dean cut the power to the lawnmower, leaving the last third of the lawn slightly longer than the rest. "What are you doing here?" Dean asked, coming to the fence. "I should ask you the same thing," the doctor said, still smiling in disbelief. "Are you working a case? Where's Sam?" Immediately, Dean lost his smile and took a step back. He cleared his throat, nodded to himself, and then changed direction. walking along the fence line, so that he could open the gate and let the doctor in. "Where's your partner?" he said pointedly. The doctor narrowed his eyes for just a second, knowing that Dean had meant that jab to hurt. But he couldn't exactly blame him. He wasn't much better talking about the Time Lords or Rose. So he simply nodded. "Not here," he said. "Neither is Sam." Dean opened the latch on the gate with a little more oomph than was necessary, and stepped back as it swung open. "So, seriously, what are you doing here?" "Not sure myself," the doctor admitted, looking around the meticulously kept yard. But then, if Dean had settled down, something like this made sense. He liked to work with his hands, to be outside, he liked to throw himself into projects, and it showed. "That sounds about right," Dean said, shaking his head. "Flying by the seat of your pants through time and space. You sure you don't want to come?" the doctor asked. He knew as soon as he asked that it was too much to ask. Just looking around, he could see that Dean had poured so much love into this new home of his, and he didn't want to take that away. Hadn't he learned anything from watching companion after companion walk away from him for a better life? A safer life? The life he led came with complications, often fatal ones, irreversible ones, and asking a Winchester who had just lost his brother to jump into a life like that was dangerous. They were liable to take him up on it, and then get themselves hurt. Still, Dean was watching the doctor after his offer, both eyebrows raised, his arms crossed over his chest. "It's tempting," he admitted at last. "More tempting than you know." The doctor held up both hands. "I don't want to mess up anything you've built here," he promised quickly. He kept one hand raised defensively, but with the other, he gestured broadly to indicate the yard and the house and the fence. "This kind of life, mowing the lawn and reading the paper and going to dinner parties, that's an adventure I know I can't handle. But that's where all the best stories are born. I get to skip the hard work that goes into building a life, but sometimes I have to wonder what I'm missing, you know?" It wasn't much of a lie. Lately, he'd been thinking about the other doctor. The one with one heart. The one who had Rose. The one who had a happy ending. And it was genuinely hard not to feel jealous of that guy. "Yeah, well, I'm trying out the normal life," Dean said, though he didn't sound excited about it. "The grass is always greener," the doctor reflected. Humans always wanted adventure until they'd had enough of it. And then, they wanted a different adventure. "Seems to suit you so far," the doctor said. "Maybe," Dean said. He paused and barely glanced at the doctor. "Anyway, I promised Sammy I'd try." "Ah," said the doctor, instantly understanding. "A promise like that, between those boys it was practically sacred. And it's what I can do, you know?" Dean continued. "I couldn't save him, but I can do this. I can make Lisa happy. I can give Ben a good life. It's what I can do, and I'm trying, you know." The doctor felt his shoulders drop as he wondered if he was ever going to find a point in time during which Dean wasn't trying desperately to help everyone else and not himself, in which the Winchesters got to be happy. But since that didn't seem likely to happen, the doctor simply nodded. "Yeah, I know," he said and followed Dean inside. Dean leaned against the wall as he watched the doctor try to be a normal houseguest. He was absolutely terrible at it, and clearly had no idea what passed for small talk in small-town America. But once he had seen the project Ben was working on for school, his whole demeanor had changed, and he'd start to extol the virtues of learning about new places. And Dean had to laugh, because judging by Ben's expression, all the doctor had managed to convince him of was that Dean had found a friend to try to help him get into his ecology project, so he could pull his grade up. And hey, that was a nice side effect, sure. But mostly Dean was entertained watching the doctor, because he remembered the last time the doctor had tried to help with homework, and Dean had ended up meeting some lizard people. He was so caught up in watching the doctor and Ben that he almost didn't see Lisa. But even after all this time had passed in his normal life, he hadn't let go of his paranoia. So almost no one could sneak up on him these days. He was, however, much better at stopping himself from startling when someone grabbed him without warning. This was a small town, and he'd done enough favors for people by fixing their cars or their yards, that people were starting to get familiar with him, starting to clap him on the back or jostle him when they talked to someone. And that was good. That meant he was starting to fit in, starting to be normal. It shouldn't have been this hard to be normal, though, right? There was something wrong with him that was having this hard of a time. "Who is he?" Lisa asked, both eyebrows raised pointedly. "Not a hunter," Dean said in an undertone, though he saw the doctor pause and look over his shoulder, and wondered if the guy had heard him. He'd always had an uncanny knack for knowing things he shouldn't, and he did have some kind of telepathic something. "Okay," Lisa said. "But who is he?" "Hard to explain." Dean said, and when she playfully hit him with the back of her hand, he held both hands up. No, really. He's a time traveler, believe it or not. After some of the stuff you've told me, yeah, I believe it. Dean chuckled at that and pulled her over to kiss her cheek. Just trust me on this, he said. You can trust him. I've known him since I was a kid. Lisa frowned at him for a moment longer, then sighed and kissed him in return. Okay, she said. Just tell me he isn't here for a reason. That part, I can't tell you. Usually, when he shows up, something's going on. Of course. Dean shrugged easily. Didn't seem like he knew why he was here either, So should I cancel that dinner reservation with the new neighbors? Lisa asked. They've been asking what side dishes they should bring tomorrow. But if we have unexpected guests, you know that might be just the excuse we need, Dean said, nodding along. That was the biggest part of living a normal life that genuinely stymied Dean. The weird politics for something as simple as getting together for dinner. There were all sorts of unwritten rules about hosting and inviting and all that, and while Dean would never admit it, he knew he didn't actually know the norms. He was used to breezing into an area, not at all changing himself, charming whoever he needed to, and then leaving. But he'd promised Sammy he'd try. So he'd ended up agreeing to have dinner with the new neighbors. But they were giving off weird vibes. It was the same couple who had come to dinner a few nights back, and they had moved right into their host's house, and Dean and Lisa hadn't even known they were going to move. They said that it had been a dinner to sign some closing papers, but still, something was off about the whole thing. And they lived next door, and Dean was determined not to lose another family. But he also didn't want to see patterns where there were none. And he didn't want to scare anyone. And he definitely didn't want to raise a kid into paranoia and too much responsibility. So, yeah, putting off the dinner was probably a good thing, right? Dean frowned as he watched the doctor talking with Ben. He had never known the doctor to not have adventure in his wake. And with these weird neighbors suddenly around, that couldn't possibly be a coincidence, right? But he and the doctor could look into it without involving Lisa and Ben. That was probably the better move. Dean was already nodding, agreeing with his decision before he vocalized it. Hey, Doc, I was actually hoping to get your opinion on something. He called out, and tried not to laugh too hard at the look of pure gratitude. Ben shot him for rescuing him from an overly interested stranger. The doctor straightened up, still smiling, and pulled his coat down. I should have known, he said. Always something with the Winchester's, isn't there? Yeah, Dean knew he didn't mean anything by it, but well, eventually, one day, maybe he'd be able to think of himself as whole, instead of only one half of a whole. But that hadn't happened yet, and he wasn't sure when it would. The doctor interrupted Dean's train of thought with a wide, sweeping gesture. Well, what's the problem? Zygons, Sinatarans, you made half those up, Ben said, though he was grinning, and Dean recognized that light. He wanted to help. That light scared Dean more than he cared to admit. What? The doctor laughed and turned to Dean. You mean you haven't even told him about the Silurians? Yeah, you haven't even told me about the Silurians, Ben said, grinning crookedly. Dean laughed and shook his head, gesturing for the doctor to join him somewhere Ben wasn't doing his homework, and the doctor, still laughing, came with him, his hands in his deep pockets. The doctor waited until they were out of Ben's earshot before, grinning obnoxiously, he looked toward Dean with both eyebrows raised. Gotta love that instinct in there, that one that says they'll run into danger no matter what you do. Yeah, I know I have no room to talk. If you start saying something parental like you were the same way at his age, I'll kick you out, Dean grumbled good-naturedly. Then I won't say that, the doctor said, but paired with his grin, that was somehow worse. Dean lifted one eyebrow in the doctor's direction. But when that only resulted in a wider grin, he laughed, shook his head, and got down to brass tacks. Okay, so these new neighbors showed up one day for a dinner party, and the next thing anyone knows, they own the house, and no one's heard from the neighbors, Dean said, sitting down with the doctor in the living room, so they could brainstorm. It took next to no time before Dean and the doctor moved their discussion out to the TARDIS. Dean didn't have any concrete proof that anything odd was up with the new neighbors, but the doctor had learned to trust Dean's instincts. More than that, the doctor had learned to trust the TARDIS to take him where he needed to go, especially lately. Especially when he still sometimes felt the call of exactly what he was trying to outrun. He had so much more left that he could do. He wasn't ready to go. He shook those thoughts off and watched instead as Dean grinned around the TARDIS, running his hands along the railings with the same reverent energy that the doctor knew he sometimes did. The doctor couldn't explain in any language the connection that the TARDIS forged between itself and anyone who had flown her, but it never went away. and it always felt deeper and more profound than the mild telepathic bond the Doctor had learned about in school on Gallifrey. The TARDIS chimed, and Dean grinned. "Missed you too," he said. The Doctor smiled and looked down at the control panel. He hadn't seen Dean grinning, not even around his new family, until that moment. And he wasn't about to point that out. Not yet, anyway. No, instead, he tucked that knowledge away and put it aside to use later, when he asked Dean to travel with him, to help him outrun destiny, in a way he knew Dean would be all too familiar with. Because Dean loved to run, it was painted all over his face. "All right, let's see what we've got," the Doctor said, sliding into place by the scanner, as the TARDIS hummed and dinged and got to work. "Must have been something big for you to come," Dean said as he stood on the other side of the console, looking around to see if the TARDIS would point him in a direction he could help. And when the TARDIS lit up a few buttons, Dean grinned and set to work. Between the two of them, then, it took no time at all before the TARDIS had its results displayed on the monitor, and the Doctor found himself pulling his glasses out of his pocket to peer at them, his mouth slightly open and scrunched up at the corner. "Well, that definitely doesn't belong on Earth," he said, turning the monitor to show Dean what the TARDIS had found. The image of Dean's neighbor's house was absolutely alight with energy signatures, the biggest of which came from underneath the house. "Looks like someone found a place to park their spaceship. They did do some gardening renovations when they moved in," Dean said, his frown pressing lines into his forehead as he looked over the readout. "What's the big signature in the kitchen?" he asked, tapping a spot in the center of the house. "Not sure," the Doctor admitted. "It's drawing its energy from the underground ship, though." "Then it's probably not good," Dean surmised. "Not necessarily. Could be they're just trying to blend in," the Doctor pointed out, frowning. He'd forgotten how quickly the Winchesters could jump to trying to solve the problem by identifying an enemy. "If that's what's happening, what happened to the people who used to live there?" Dean pointed out. "Something's going on. Plus, I doubt the TARDIS would bring you here just to say, hey, some aliens are living here." He patted the console affectionately. "Right? You wouldn't be overly dramatic, would you?" he asked. The TARDIS dinged, and the Doctor rolled his eyes. "Anyway," he said pointedly, "let's investigate before we jump to conclusions." "Was always gonna do that, Doc." Dean crossed his arms and leaned with one hip against the console, holding most of his body weight. "What's on your mind?" "I'm fine," the Doctor said, waving a hand dismissively as he read over the readouts one more time, frowning. He recognized this energy signature, but he was having a hard time placing it. Too many lives, too many adventures stuck in his head. "You sure?" Dean asked. The Doctor held up a hand and lightly shook his head, taking his glasses off and turning them in his hands, to give himself something to do as he searched his memories. There was something there. "Androgum." The Doctor snapped his fingers and broke into a grin as he finally put it together. "Of course. That's why it looked so familiar." "Jasundit," Dean said dryly. "You want to explain for those of us that don't speak Klingon?" The Doctor grinned at that and pointed at the readouts. "I ran into some androgums a long time ago. They were working with the Sontarans." "Okay, them I know," Dean said, standing up a little straighter with information he could work with. "I don't see anything that indicates the Sontarans are working with this group, though," the Doctor said. "Looks like they just came here looking for something to eat. Probably took a space hopper looking for a new cuisine." "Why do I get the feeling that's bad news?" Dean said with one eyebrow raised. The Doctor sighed and ran a hand down his face. "Well," he said slowly, "they're not picky eaters. They'll hunt and kill pretty much anything including intelligent species." He tucked his glasses into his pocket, his eyes narrowed. "Almost lost Jamie that way," he said, almost under his breath. "McCrimmon?" Dean raised both eyebrows. "That would not have been a good way to go. Speaking as someone who regularly gets nearly eaten." The Doctor chuckled at that. "I suppose it's an occupational hazard for you, huh? Used to be, anyway. Right." The Doctor took a deep breath and let it out again. "Best thing we can do is outwit them or redirect them. Get them off planet. Even if they're not hunting people at the moment, we can't guarantee that they won't get there eventually." "And they were working with the Sontarans?" Dean asked, frowning. "You sure they're not still teamed up? I met one of those a few years back." "It's worth looking into," the Doctor said, both eyebrows raised. But then, spoilers, he couldn't remember meeting any Sontarans with Dean, so that must have been a different Doctor. "But they're definitely not safe to have anywhere near Lisa and Ben. You could probably work with them, but you can't trust them," the Doctor agreed. "And don't, under any circumstances, Go to anything they invite you to involving food. Dean pulled a face. Right, makes sense. Glad we canceled dinner, then. No kidding. The doctor straightened up, and this time, he let himself fall into a mischievous grin. So, Dean, he said, gesturing toward the TARDIS door, shall we see what's on the menu? The Thurnstons, who answered the door when Dean and the doctor knocked with the same excited smiles that they had shown Dean and Lisa when they had extended the invitation to dinner, didn't look like aliens, as far as Dean could tell. He knew better than to make assumptions, obviously, but the doctor had described unibrows and red hair. And sure, there stood a couple of redeeds, but they looked normal. Well, as normal as anyone could look when they were almost hungrily gesturing Dean and the doctor in. Hey, sorry about the last-minute change in plans, Dean said. He hadn't set foot in the house yet, but held up both hands. The Thurnstons glanced at each other, and Mr. Thurnston, he'd never given his first name, pointed at the doctor. We haven't seen you around here before, he said in almost an accusation. The doctor grinned easily and pulled out his well-worn wallet. Name's the doctor, he said cheerfully. Dreadfully sorry, but Lisa and Ben have come down with the beige fever, and we wanted to make sure it hasn't spread beyond that household. Dean almost laughed as he watched the Thurnstons take measured steps back from the doorway, no longer actively trying to draw them in. The beige fever? Mrs. Thurnston asked, her hands twisted in a flour-covered apron. Nasty stuff, the doctor said, pulling a dramatic face as he put on his glasses and made a big show of looking around the living room, while the Thurnstons scurried out of his way and looked like they weren't sure if they wanted to kick him out or not. Absolutely horrendous. You definitely don't want to catch it. Well, what about him? Mrs. Thurnston asked, pointing at Dean. Why would you bring him here if he's infected? Dean held up both hands. Hey now, he started to say, but in typical fashion, the doctor had taken charge of the situation. Childhood immunity. I don't suppose either of you had it as kids? The doctor looked them both over. No, you'd remember if you had, he said dismissively before either of the Thurnstons could respond. Yeah, got the scars to prove it, Dean said, deciding he might as well lean into it and go for the intimidation. Scars? Mr. Thurnston repeated. Yeah, don't you know what the beige fever does to a person? Dean said, perfectly straight-faced, though he almost ruined his poker face when he saw the doctor cough a chuckle into his hand as he looked around the house. Look, we can reschedule the dinner party, Mr. Thurnston said. If your family is sick, then that's all there is to it. Dean thumbed over his shoulder at the doctor, who was attacking the place with abandon, already starting to turn over cushions on the couch. Tell that to him. He's the one trying to prevent an outbreak. But if you don't want to be sure you're safe. The Thurnstons once again glanced at each other. How long is this going to take? Mr. Thurnston said, his arms crossed and his foot tapping. Shouldn't be long, the doctor said cheerfully as he pulled out his sonic screwdriver and started to scan everything in sight. Mr. Thurnston tapped his fingers, irritated, before he turned toward Dean. You're not sick, right? He said, pointing at him in almost an accusation. Well, no, Dean started to say, and that seemed to be enough for the would-be dinner host. Then you should at least eat with us, Mrs. Thurnston said, immediately switching from the off-kilter homeowner to the gracious host she had been when she first extended the dinner invitation. I just tried a new recipe, and I need a local's opinion. Dean glanced toward the doctor, but the doctor was already muttering to himself, fully focused on whatever he was doing with his sonic screwdriver. I'm actually not a local, Dean started to say, but that didn't seem to matter to the Thurnstons, who had flanked him with unsettlingly polite smiles. Oh, but we insist, Mrs. Thurnston said. Dean was very sure that he didn't want to try whatever recipe they had in mind, knowing what the doctor had told him about their eating habits. But even he had to admit when he got to the dining room that everything smelled amazing. The spices smelled good anyway, and they masked whatever meat was in the oven. Yeah, I'm gonna need to douse my brain in bleach after this, Dean decided, even as Mrs. Thurnston went on and on about how badly they were going to miss the side dishes he and Lisa had promised to bring to the dinner party. Yeah, we'll send you the salad dressing recipe, Dean said, because this whole thing was too weird, and he was still mentally recovering from thinking the food smelled good. That would be perfect, Mrs. Thurnston said, and the weird part was that she sounded perfectly sincere. My husband and I collect recipes, actually. We bring some back home from every new place we visit. Big travelers, then? Yes, but probably nowhere you've heard of, Mr. Thurnston said, smirking. You'd be surprised, Dean said, returning the smirk with one of his own, while his gaze roamed around the dining room. These people were, if nothing else, incredibly serious about their food. The dinner hadn't even been brought out yet, but the dining table looked meticulous, like everything on it was their most prized possession. Actually, knowing what he did, Dean figured that wasn't too far from the truth. The people who owned this house before we did gave us a recipe for pulled pork, Mr. Thurston said. So, we had to try it for ourselves. Pulled pork? Huh, Dean said. He didn't trust that. But if that was true, at least he would feel a little better about the smell. Yes, I really think I've got it right this time, Mrs. Thurston said. The butcher gave us the whole pig when I told him I was going to try as many recipes as I was. Wow, Dean smirked to himself but didn't voice what he was thinking. Space foodies. You've somehow managed to make space foodies dangerous, Doc. How am I surprised? Come on. Then, Mr. Thurston said, though no sooner had he gestured for them to sit down at the dining room table, then there was a huge thump from downstairs, followed by several more thuds and a sound that Dean only knew was laser fire, because he'd faced a saunter-in before. Everything okay? Dean asked, though he was ready for a fight. The Thurstons shared glances again, and then, all at once, they switched from the gracious hosts they had been pretending to be until then into the aliens the doctor had described. Mr. Thurston lunged for Dean, his eyes wild and his hands reaching for Dean's throat, while Mrs. Thurston rushed to check out whatever the doctor had discovered. But Dean had seen it coming, and he stepped back, letting Mr. Thurston crash into the table. As Mr. Thurston turned to face Dean with a snarl on his lips, Dean smiled, settling into a fighting stance, and trying not to think about how much he'd missed this. The thing about dealing with androgams was that they did, in fact, have good cooking instincts, and so, their cellar smelled wonderful. Their problem wasn't with the way they spiced their food or the combinations of foods they made. It was that they didn't seem to care whether or not their food started out sentient. Normally, the doctor wouldn't have thought too much about the smell, and would have focused on the task at hand. But in the mood he was in lately, and considering the fact that smell was the fastest gateway into memory, he couldn't help but pause and get caught up in the scent of a spicy herb that he knew had come from a leisure moon, a few galaxies away from Earth. The locals had specifically set up tourist attractions with food flavored with that herb, because it was so well known. And he had been there with Rose. He stopped and closed his eyes, shaking his head as if he could physically shake the memory away, as if he could get rid of her face. When he thought too long about the last time he'd seen her, she was happy now, happy with someone who could live a human life with her, and that was good. He passed a salt container and tried not to linger too long in the memory of Donna, trying to find something salty for him to eat. When he thought too long about Donna, he could only mourn how badly he had failed her. And he didn't feel much better when he thought of Martha. Martha, who had deserved so much better than him, who he had asked too much of. He stopped again in his search of the cellar, took his glasses off, turned them around a few times in his hands, and then put them back on. He was getting lost in the past, and as a rule, he tried not to do that. That was a fundamental rule of being a time traveler. He couldn't dwell too long on regrets, or he would drown in them. And he had plenty of regrets. This is what happens when someone tells you you're going to die, he thought as he ran his hands over the shelves of spices and vegetables, looking for any sign of a lever or hidden switch. Stop getting lost, Doctor. You've got a problem to solve. Aha! He grinned and stepped back as one of the shelves sank into the floor, revealing a corridor lit by red and yellow lights. Far down the corridor, the doctor could see something else glowing in the next room. Probably the power source for their craft. Knew it, he said, smiling. There's always a hidden. He paused and glanced to his left and right, realizing that there was no one there to talk to. Right. He sighed and took a deep breath, settling his shoulders as he strode into the hallway, and immediately nearly jumped out of his skin when a silent alarm went off, with flashing lights practically screaming at his senses. See, this is what happens when you get lost in your own head. He berated himself, belatedly pulling out his sonic screwdriver. And yes, there was the sensor he'd missed, declaring his intrusion to everyone upstairs. Well, if his position had been announced, there was nothing for it but to run straight into the trouble, right? He rushed forward and then yelped and jumped back when some kind of security door slammed down in front of him. A laser of some sort fired at him, and he scrambled away, waiting for the firing to die down, and knocking over a few things in the process. Whoops, the doctor said, wincing at the mess of spices and other ingredients now spread out all over the floor. He righted a jar that was still wobbling and then held his hands out, watching to see if anything else was going to fall. And then, seeing that nothing else was going to fall and seeing that the laser had stopped firing, he turned his attention back down the hidden hallway. Now what have you got hidden in there? The doctor asked, tucking his tongue into the corner of his mouth as he played with the frequencies of his sonic screwdriver. looking for the right one to open the door again. Before he could get too involved, though, he heard a thump. He paused and held his breath, but now, he could also hear the high-pitched whine of weapons the next floor up, as well as the sound of a struggle. That'd be Dean, he thought to himself, smirking. Can't take him anywhere without him finding a fight. But he was pretty sure the sound he'd heard wasn't the fight. It had sounded closer, and the sounds of the fight up above him were all muffled. No, something or someone else was down in that cellar with him. He just had to figure out where. He held his breath, listening, waiting. There. He wanted to rush toward the sound, but his first step was into a pile of spices, and he nearly lost his footing. In his flailing, he reached out to grab the top of one of the shelves, and ended up knocking over a bag full of flour. He looked down at himself, spitting flour out in great clouds, and shaking it off of his coat. Well, he said, shaking his head, that's not good. Definitely shouldn't be flouring myself to make their job easier. As soon as he voiced that thought out loud, he heard another thump, and this time, he was positively certain that he also heard a muffled sob coming from the far corner of the cellar, behind a rack of dusty wine bottles. "Hello?" the doctor called out, making his way through the various food supplies. "Hello, my name is the doctor. I'm here to help," he promised as he rounded the corner of the rack of wine. The woman sitting on the floor, tied up hand and foot and with a rag stuffed into her mouth, looked up at the doctor with tear-stained cheeks, her eyes red from crying, and her wrists and ankles raw from her attempts to escape. She was breathing heavily as he approached and closed her eyes, flinching away from him instinctively, even though she wasn't trying to push herself away from him. The doctor paused. He could hear the fight going on upstairs still, so he didn't want to waste too much time. But he also knew that this woman was terrified and needed a kind hand. So, he forced his shoulders to drop and gave her a gentle smile. "I promise, I'm not here to hurt you," he said in a whisper. The woman nodded, though she was still obviously terrified, her chest heaving as he came to sit beside her. Her eyes closed when he reached out to remove the gag from her mouth. But then, the second he had finished untying her, she simply fell apart, throwing herself into him, so that he had no other option but to catch her as she sobbed onto his shoulder. Dean was having more fun than he'd had since Sam died, and he hated to admit it to himself. He'd been living the quiet life for so long that he was starting to finally believe that he could make it work, that he was actually capable of being a good father, a good man. But the second he was thrown into a good fight, the second he was back into the hunt, it felt right. Like that was what he'd been born to do. Except Sam wasn't there with him, and this wasn't his life anymore. It couldn't be his life anymore, or he'd just get more people he cared about killed. But it really was thrilling as the Androgams pulled out weapons that looked like nothing he'd seen on Earth, and immediately settled into stances that he had seen a million times before. Alien or not, he knew what it looked like when a humanoid was hunting another humanoid. They really weren't that different from vampires or anything else he'd hunted. Mrs. Thurston shot at him, and Dean dove underneath the table, kicking one of the chairs out, so that it hit Mr. Thurston, and made him stumble back a step, losing his footing enough that Dean could reach out and grab his ankle to upend him, before Dean could pounce toward Mr. Thurston to try to wrestle that fancy gun away from him. Though, Mrs. Thurston peeked underneath the table and fired at him. Dean tried to roll out of the way, but she must have anticipated that, and had aimed low to the ground, catching him in the foot, before he could quite get out of her range. As Dean let out a cry, Mrs. Thurston let out a cackle of delight. "Oh, this one is a lot harder to catch than the last ones," she told her husband, who was also clearly enjoying himself. "He moves like a predator himself," Mr. Thurston said. "Look at that crouch." Dean narrowed his eyes and tried to resist the urge to look down at himself, though he didn't quite manage it. It was hard not to. The way these people were talking about him, as if he was an interesting animal, well, it wasn't the first time it had happened, but it was disconcerting all the same. And being described as a predator. Yeah, he wasn't sure he liked that. His foot was throbbing, but he could still put weight on it, so he sprang out of his crouch and dived at Mrs. Thurston. She looked like she had been ready for the move and had her gun pointed right at him. But he knew the best way to distract them both, and had, in the process of pouncing toward her, kicked out with his bad foot. He didn't need to have finesse to knock over the entire dining room table. The whole thing went crashing over, and the Thurstons both immediately let out cries of dismay and anger as they tried to catch the table, as well as the expensive-looking things that they had set out for dinner. And that was exactly the opening Dean had hoped to create. He took a running start and tackled Mr. Thurston to the floor, wrestling his fancy alien gun away from him. He kneed him in the side just for good measure, and to create an opening, so he could safely put distance between himself and Mr. Thurston. He wasn't sure if the guy had any hidden weapons on him, and when he was outnumbered 2-1, he wasn't going to leave anything to chance. He rolled to his feet and fired at Mrs. Thurston, taking advantage of her distraction over the table being knocked over, as well as the fact that she was worried for her husband when she heard him cry out. He fired 3 times, hitting her in the chest, and she went down, gasping and hurt and unconscious almost immediately, but she was still breathing. Of course, when Mr. Thurston saw that his wife was down, he let out a sound like a growl and lunged for Dean, forgetting the weapon in his hand in favor of his baser instincts, which Dean had been hoping for. The weapon Dean was holding was scalding hot in his hand after being fired so many times in rapid succession. Dean was honestly worried about overloading it. Mr. Thurston had the advantage of rage as he knocked Dean to the ground, and hit him hard enough that Dean was seeing stars. But Dean was already moving to strike back with the gun, slamming the hot metal into Mr. Thurston's face, until he could hear flesh burning. Dean's hand was also burning, but hey, he was used to it. Mr. Thurston screamed and stumbled away from Dean, who kicked out with his legs, reversing their positions, so that Dean was on top of him. The stuff that had been on the table was all over the floor beside them, so Dean grabbed the first thing he could get his hands on, using the heavy bowl to add weight to his blows, since the Thurstons seemed to be a little hardier than normal people were. Dean pounded Mr. Thurston's head and shoulders, a smile of grim satisfaction playing with his mouth the entire time. And just as the guy started to still, something exploded across Dean's chest. He fell back gasping, holding his chest and what was left of his shirt, where the gun Mr. Thurston had finally remembered to use, had hit him. He felt like he was on fire where the gun had hit him, though thankfully, there wasn't a bullet hole, just heat. Still hurt, though. Dean was breathing heavily, and so was Mr. Thurston, as they both gathered themselves to renew the fight. He was struggling to get upright, but Mr. Thurston was moving slower than he was, badly staggered by the beating that Dean had given him. Dean managed to stand by grabbing onto a nearby chair, but as soon as he did that, his eyesight went bright white, and he nearly lost his footing again. He couldn't see anything, and he was half braced for a hit, especially when he heard a loud, metallic clang. "Well, that had a bit more heft than I thought it did," said a familiar, British-sounding voice, even as Mr. Thurston collapsed to the ground. "Good timing," Dean said, though he was still wincing through his movements. He looked past the doctor to see a scared-looking woman standing behind him, though her fear turned to anger when she saw the Thurstons. It took Dean a second, but at long last, he recognized who he was looking at, the neighbor the Thurstons had supposedly replaced. So, yeah, Dean wasn't going to argue it when she went for the gun Mr. Thurston had dropped. Her gaze and her anger turned toward the monsters who had invaded her home and kept her captive. Wait a minute. The doctor cursed himself for not keeping a closer eye on the woman he had rescued. He'd been preoccupied with Dean's fight, but he had known Dean long enough that he should have known Dean would be able to handle himself. And now, this hurting, desperate woman had a gun. And there was nothing more dangerous than a hurting, desperate human with a gun. He moved quickly and got in front of this woman, keeping his hands up in a peaceful gesture. "Now, wait a minute," he said again when he saw that she was already trying to step around him to get a better shot. "Get out of the way," she said, her voice shaking. "I can get their ship out of your basement," the doctor said. "I can send them away to the other side of the galaxy." "No." Her hands were shaking. "Do you know what he did?" "Yes." The doctor held her gaze and took a step toward her. "They won't do it again. They sure won't." She took a step back, taking a tighter grip on her gun. "Look," the doctor started to say, but before he could get another word in, he heard the click of something metal behind him, and knew without turning around what had happened. "Dean," he said quietly, more tired than he meant to sound. He'd meant to find an old friend to travel with him for a while, but he'd nearly forgotten about humans. Scared humans. Stupid, scared humans. "Got an easy solution, Doc," Dean said simply. "Unless you think they're not gonna go and eat someone else wherever you send them." "They ate my husband," the woman said, her pitch rising and her hand steadying. Her anger was reaching that point. The one he had seen too many times, the one he had seen in himself before. "You can still take the ship," Dean said reasonably. "Don't have a problem with that part." "I don't want to hurt you," the woman said. "You got me out of there." Despite the situation, the doctor felt an almost hysteria bubbling up at the suggestion that she could hurt him. She couldn't. He knew how he was going to die. He knew who would come knocking, and it wasn't this woman. It wasn't Dean either. I don't want to hurt you either, the doctor said. Zap. The doctor flinched, knowing exactly what had happened before he even turned around. Zap. The doctor spun to see Dean, standing there with a gun still in hand, glaring down at the now dead bodies of the couple he'd just been fighting. What did you do that for? The doctor demanded, his full attention now on Dean, even as he heard the owner of the house drop her own gun and sink to the ground, crying. Her anger had passed, and she was moving on into loss, but he couldn't focus on her, not when he was too angry. This is what I do, Dean shot back, matching the doctor's anger with his own. You've known me my whole life, Doc. You know what my job is. You're retired. Doesn't make me any less right, Dean said, gesturing with one hand toward the bodies on the floor. Tell me the truth. If they'd lived, do you really think they wouldn't have trapped someone else, some other family, and done the exact same thing on whatever planet they went to next? You didn't have to. Yeah, I did, Dean said. You weren't going to. No, I was going to send them out of this galaxy. To eat someone else. Dean practically shouted back at him. Doc, you're a good friend, and I'm glad to see you again, but you're something else trying to claim the high road, when you're willing to be an accessory to murder like that. The doctor glared at Dean and let out a frustrated scoff. Humans, he spat out. Every time you get scared. What? Deal with the problem? Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. The doctor held his glare for a moment longer before he did, finally, turn to the woman who had collapsed to the floor. And she, at least, was easier to feel for. He crouched down to be at her level, and made a visible effort to calm himself down. I'm going to get that ship out of your basement, he told her. Good, she said simply, around a racking sob. I'm sorry, he told her. I'm so sorry. She didn't respond to him other than to tuck herself into a tighter ball and cry harder. He didn't blame her for that, though. She'd been through too much and had lost too much. She needed a good cry. He frowned her way for a moment longer before he turned around to see Dean already crouching by the bodies of the aliens he'd killed, clearly making sure that they stayed down. The doctor narrowed his eyes at that, but when Dean looked up to meet his gaze, all Dean did was shrug and go back to his work. Knew I was a hunter the day you met me, Doc, he said, and didn't raise his gaze. Can't seem to shake the life. The doctor watched Dean work, his narrowed eyes shifting into something softer despite his best efforts. You could if you wanted to. Trying, Dean said simply, tightly. The doctor stayed there for just a bit longer before, with a sigh, he turned on his heel and went to deal with the spaceship. He'd hoped that this trip would help him. He'd hoped that the TARDIS had brought him there so he could travel with Dean for a while, even a few adventures, like they'd done when he was a kid. But now no, he couldn't ask Dean to come with him. Donna had warned him about what it was like when he was alone. The way Dean was at this moment in his timeline, the way he was raw and hurt and too willing to fall back on old habits in a vain search for something that made sense. No, he couldn't travel with Dean. Not this Dean, anyway. Would you bring me here? He muttered under his breath even though he was nowhere near the TARDIS, and didn't expect an answer anyway. She always had a mind of her own. Dean didn't need to make eye contact with the doctor to know they were on the outs, but it still stung. Somehow, when the doctor barely even glanced his way, he had promised to get rid of the ship for them, so he couldn't just storm off, but it looked like that was exactly what he wanted to do. Not that that was terribly surprising. Dean hadn't had a win in a while. Not where it counted, anyway. Not with the people he cared about. Probably won't see him again, he thought. Briefly, he remembered a few times the doctor or his companions had mentioned other adventures, but maybe he was misremembering. Or maybe he'd just meet the companion sometime. While his neighbor was trying to pick up the pieces of her life, Dean knew he didn't have much to offer there. So he backed out of the house, his hands in his pockets. He was planning to just go back home, so he didn't have to listen to the doctor once again try to lecture him about his way of doing things. The guy had known from the start that he was a hunter. He should have been used to it by then. But then, he saw the TARDIS at the end of the street. He glanced over his shoulder, confirmed that the doctor was still cleaning up inside, and walked a little bit faster, coming to rest his hand on the outside of the TARDIS with a tired smile. Hey, he said quietly, thanks for coming to see me, but I don't think the doctor wants to hang out with hunters. He rested his head against the TARDIS door, but he could only hear a hum of energy from inside it. Yeah, I get it. I wouldn't want to talk to me either, Dean said. He picked his head up to go, but as soon as he did that, the TARDIS dinged, sounding indignant. What? Dean spun around, holding his hands out to his sides. What did you bring him here for anyway? I was going to have dinner with those creeps soon. I'd have figured out what was wrong, and would have killed them with or without the doctor getting involved. I don't need your help. I'm glad we're friends, but you can't save me, okay? Stop trying. No response. Dean let out a sound from the back of his throat and spun on his heel almost directly into the doctor, who had somehow managed to sneak up on him. "Don't do that," Dean said, taking a step back, already prepared for a fight. But to his surprise, the doctor's anger had faded. He looked tired, and for the first time since Dean had met him, he looked like he was as old as he claimed to be. "She really does care about you," the doctor said. Of course his expression softened for the TARDIS. She was his greatest love. Dean shouldn't have been surprised. "Yeah," Dean said with an easy shrug. "Feelings mutual." The doctor tipped his head to watch Dean for a moment longer before, with a heavy sigh, he reached past him to open the door to the TARDIS. "One of these days, you'll realize how rare that is. Maybe she just needs someone who speaks her language, that's all," Dean said. He looked past the doctor toward the TARDIS interior, toward its warm light, toward the constant hum of energy that he could see as well as feel. "Maybe." The doctor paused, his hand still on the open door. He hadn't stepped inside. "You're giving up the life?" "Yeah, seems like you have a good thing going with this family of yours." "I hope so." "I hope so too." The doctor still hadn't stepped inside. "You could come with me, you know. I'd bring you right back where I left you." Both of Dean's eyebrows shot up, and he looked past the doctor once again to the TARDIS interior. It was tempting, unbelievably so. And it would be exciting. There would be constant adventure, constant movement. It would be easy to lose himself in a life like that. To forget. To get away from Earth. From the memories of Sam. And it would be easy to find something that might finally be the end of him. But no, he'd promised Sam he wouldn't do that. And a temptation like that, at every new planet, was probably not a good idea. Not this soon after everything that had happened. He wasn't very good at this emotion thing. But he knew enough to know when to play it safe. "I promised I'd try this normal life thing," Dean said, though he felt as if he were hearing himself from far away. "I know." The doctor sighed and tucked his glasses away into a pocket on his long coat. "But you're not a hunter anymore. Might be time to start acting like it." Dean couldn't think of anything to say in response, and he certainly didn't know what to do with the expression on the doctor's face as he disappeared into the TARDIS. But he stepped back as he heard the TARDIS start whirring, staring at the big blue box until it disappeared from view. "See you next time," he said, pressing his mouth into a line, before he shoved his hands into his pockets and turned around, and tried very hard not to think about what would have happened if he'd agreed to go with the doctor. "I want to go home." The doctor let his shoulders drop, but he couldn't exactly blame Clara. She had taken a shower in her room in the TARDIS. But that didn't erase the fact that she had been covered in blood, and who knows what else not that long ago. She had every reason to want to rest and recover, and he really did feel bad. He had personally vouched for the Winchesters, and what had happened? Clara was never going to trust them again, but the TARDIS loved the boys. The doctor doubted this would be the last time they'd run into each other. The trick, then, would be trying to find them earlier in their timeline, before Dean lost himself. The doctor started pulling levers and pushing buttons, a bit more subdued than usual as they headed home, but every time Clara looked his way, he put on a smile for her. "Next time, I should take you to one of my favorite nebulas. You can hear the stars singing as they're being formed. But only there. A planetary explosion 100 years ago sent psychic waves from the population into the nebula." "Sounds interesting," Clara said, though she was half distracted as she put her hair up, watching the doctor work the controls. "And also maybe a bit depressing." "It's an entire planet's worth of art and emotion," the doctor said. Clara smiled softly and came to join him at the controls, looking over his shoulder. "Home first, though," she said, and he nodded. "Yes, of course. Unless you wanted." "No, home first. I need rest," Clara said. "But if you want to go get into trouble without me, just promise me you won't get stuck," she added, more of her usual teasing smile coming back. She had been shaken pretty badly, yes, but the doctor was relieved to see she somehow hadn't been scared off. "Me? Stuck?" he teased her, and she shook her head and squeezed his arm. "Never," she agreed, matching his teasing tone. Soon enough, the TARDIS had touched down outside her home, and the doctor waved her off with a promise to be back soon. And, really, as he closed the doors to the TARDIS, he had to admit that he was glad she insisted on taking care of herself, on taking breaks. That was smart. He was just so frustrated that she needed to leave. Well, that could have gone better, he told the TARDIS dryly as he went back to her console, looking over the controls, as he tried to think of somewhere to go. That would be enough of a change, that he could get his emotional feet back underneath him. The TARDIS dinged its agreement, sounding almost forlorn. "Well," the doctor clapped his hands together. "Where to next, old girl? Can't stay here and let the grass grow." The TARDIS dinged at him, and he broke into a smile, moving with a bit more energy around the console, as he got ready to leave, shooting one last glance at the monitor to see if Clara was okay, before he patted the console right in the center, grinning at the ding he got in response. "Of course I trust you," he said, and then had to grip onto the console tightly, when takeoff was a smidge more exciting than usual. "Oh, you're in a mood." Soon enough, the TARDIS dinged to let him know she had landed, and the doctor checked the information on the instruments. He was still on Earth and not too far in time either. A small jump across the pond to America a couple years before when he'd just left Clara, which was itself about a year before where he and Clara had jumped when he'd suggested a trip to Earth. Small jumps this time. The doctor asked, leaning forward to look over the information. A small town in the middle of nowhere, middle of the United States on a Sunday? Winchester's on the brain still, he guessed, shaking his head as he reached out to stroke the central column. The TARDIS opened its doors in response, almost expectantly. "Well, you've never been patient before. I can't possibly expect you to start now," the doctor said, readjusting his bow tie. With that, he strolled out into a crisp fall day, somewhere in the southeast of the United States, judging by the forests that were only now starting to show their colors. A few birds still sang in the trees, and the mosquitoes hadn't gotten cold enough to go away. Neither had the flies. It was, in short, the worst kind of fall day, but it was crisp. "What have you gotten us into?" The doctor mused in the TARDIS's direction. But she had already shut her doors, probably to keep out the bugs. He let out a huff of a laugh at that, and then spun himself around, pointed in a direction that seemed like it might include adventure, and started walking. He couldn't see anybody around, and he walked directly into a spiderweb at one point. The sun wasn't setting. There was no indication of life other than the occasional deer, and this was surprisingly boring. He was just about to turn around and admit defeat, which he hated to do, but he was starting to suspect that he'd picked the wrong direction, when he heard just the softest sound of footsteps. Whoever was coming his way wasn't trying to warn animals off, but he wasn't sneaking around, either. But he was oddly quiet, too. Most humans out in the middle of nowhere would stop occasionally to look at something, or maybe they'd have a pet with them, or they'd be listening to music. But this was just a straight, unflinching march. Definitely worth investigating. He tried to be as quiet as he could as he followed the source of the noise, wincing when he stepped on something that snapped. He used to know how to do this sort of thing. And yes, he was capable of being conniving. And, if he said so himself, he was very clever. But this particular regeneration, well, he hadn't been sneaky ever since he took this form. A couple iterations ago, though, he could have gone without a sound. Maybe those big ears were good for hearing how much noise I was making, he thought to himself, laughing under his breath. And speaking of sounds, the noise he had been following shifted and headed his way, still echoing with deliberate footsteps. And since the doctor knew he'd been found out, he didn't try to hide or shy away from what was coming. Instead, he leaned against a tree and crossed his arms, doing his best to look cool. "What are you doing here?" a familiar voice asked long before the doctor could see who was coming. Immediately, the doctor straightened up, his pretenses falling away, because that voice sounded like Sam Winchester, but the psychic impression he was getting, well, he wasn't getting one. And that was very much not good at all. Dean was pretty sure something was up with Sam. He had tried not to think about it, because at first, he had been too relieved to see Sam again, that it hadn't mattered. Nothing ever mattered but keeping their family together. Nothing but keeping Sam safe. That had been his whole purpose in life, and he'd failed at it. And Sam was back. He had a second chance. He wasn't going to examine the teeth of that particular gift horse, but maybe it was time for a dental visit. It had started as a feeling, but lately, watching the way Sam hunted, well, he had questions, a lot of them, and he didn't think Sam had the answers either. Or if he did, he certainly wasn't going to tell Dean. Dean had every intention of grilling his brother, now that they were out in the woods on their own, too. It was the perfect opportunity. No one else was around, and there was always the excuse of the hunt, if the grilling got too intense, and they needed some excuse to pivot to another topic of conversation. The only thing left to do was decide which of the many burning questions on his mind he wanted to lead with. But then, he'd heard the unmistakable sound of the TARDIS, echoing through the trees, and he broke into a grin and turned toward Sam, who had no reaction to the sound at all. Dean narrowed his eyes at that. But then, this was the perfect opportunity. After all, he knew from experience that the doctor had some kind of telepathic something. Maybe he could get Sam looked at without having to actually grill his brother. Maybe he could avoid the dentist himself and make the doctor examine Sam's proverbial teeth. I'm going to look into that, he said, thumbing over his shoulder in the direction of the TARDIS. It had echoed, sure, but he was pretty sure he could track it down. It had sounded close. Sam shrugged without looking his way. We already know what we'll find there. And you don't think he'll help? I think he'll catch up to us. He's not a hunter, Sam. If you want to go looking for him, no one's stopping you, Sam said, crouching down to examine something on the ground. Dean frowned and came to join him, his expression falling when he realized that Sam had found blood. We're close. Dean clenched his jaw to keep from swearing out loud. Yeah, Sam didn't say anything other than to keep going down the trail, but Dean hesitated, looking between Sam's retreating back in the woods. He wanted Sam safe, so he needed to have his back during this hunt, but the larger problem was still going to be here, even after they killed this Rugeru. And if the doctor didn't catch up to them and left before Dean could talk to him, maybe if he was fast, he could have Sam's back in both ways. He nodded to himself and then took off at a sprint toward the sound of the TARDIS. If he couldn't find it in a reasonable amount of time, then he'd turn around. But he didn't want to walk away from a shot at understanding what was up with his brother. He ran for a good 5 minutes before he came to a small creek and stopped, listening for any signs of otherworldly life. He could hear a few frogs and other wildlife, but that was also good to hear, because it meant that the monster they were hunting hadn't scared them off. He hadn't scared them off with his sprinting either, though he'd scared off a few birds on the way. He took a deep breath, held it, and let it out again. Maybe running full speed toward what was maybe the sound of the TARDIS wasn't the right call. It wasn't going to call out to him if he was headed the wrong way. He couldn't play Marco Polo with the thing. Well, he couldn't play Marco Polo out loud. With a smirk, he closed his eyes as the plan came to him, and he forced himself to breathe slower, listening not for the sound of animals, but for something else. Something that he couldn't even say was audible, but he could feel it ever since he'd connected to the TARDIS enough to fly it. Marco, he thought, then wondered if that game even translated to the TARDIS. He waited and was about to turn back around to go have Sam's back when he heard, distinctly, the sound of the TARDIS dinging farther into the trees. He was close. He grinned and took off at a run again, vaulting over the creek and pushing through some close-set trees, before he finally found the small clearing where the TARDIS had set down. It looked the same as it always did, though it did have a couple lizards climbing up its sides. Dean grinned and ran up to the door to knock on it. Hello? He called out. Is the doctor home, or did he already leave? There was no answer, and he'd been loud enough that he was sure the doctor would have heard him if he was close by. Still, he tried one more time. Doc. When he didn't get an immediate answer, he shook his head and turned back to the TARDIS. Thanks for helping me find you, he said, and was surprised not to get a warm hum in response. He raised both eyebrows and stepped back. You okay? No response. Dean looked around, but couldn't see any clues to the TARDIS's bad mood. Frowning, he stepped toward the console and ran his hands over the edge of it. Hey, whatever I did to you, I'm sorry about it. I'm sure I felt bad about it. I don't actually know when you last saw me. This time, he did get a reassuring ding, though it sounded almost reluctant. Dean sighed and leaned against the console. Wait, were you offended I didn't say hi to you before I yelled for the doctor? He asked and then tried not to laugh when the TARDIS dinged back at him. Come on, you know you're my favorite. The doc's not nearly as cool as you are. This time, the TARDIS didn't make a noise so much as it filled his emotions with warmth. It was a strange telepathic experience, sure, but it was the only way she could communicate. And it was nice to be back on speaking terms with her, so to speak. Okay, but I do actually need to find the doctor, Dean said, and once again tried not to laugh when the warmth immediately receded. Seriously, something's wrong with Sam. The TARDIS opened its doors, but it also turned a video screen on, whipping it toward Dean to show a recording of the direction the doctor had gone in. You're the best, Dean said, and even playfully blew a kiss toward the console, grinning when he got a rush of warmth in response. At least the TARDIS hadn't changed. The doctor walked alongside Sam in silence for a long time. The silence didn't seem to bother Sam, who was intent on what he was doing, and more or less seemed to take the doctor's presence as a side detail, instead of trying to engage with him. And that was weird enough to be concerning, but the doctor was more than happy to take advantage of the silence to put his mind to the problem in front of him. Sam had always had a distinct psychic impression on the space around him, ever since he was a kid. But this wasn't that. This was an empty space. It wasn't even a drain. It was nothing. "So, what's the hunt this time?" the doctor asked after confirming, again, that he really had felt nothing from Sam. He wasn't sure if this was Sam. He didn't see Dean anywhere nearby. "Where's Dean?" "Looking for you," Sam said simply. The doctor had never heard him sound so much like he didn't care. Even the times that the doctor had seen the worst of them, their flaw was that they wanted to protect each other, not this. "Well, let's find him before he gets lost," the doctor said, but Sam shook his head. "He can follow the same trail I'm following," he said, "and we can't let this thing get away." The doctor frowned and looked behind them. "And what is this thing?" "Rugeru," Sam said. The word spat like a curse. But even if his features twisted in distaste, it was too much. Like he was putting on a show to act like he was disgusted with the thing he was hunting. He was mimicking emotion, but the doctor could feel nothing coming from him. The doctor narrowed his eyes and then came to a stop, though Sam didn't stop with him. "And what are you?" he asked, crossing his arms. Finally, Sam turned back to look at the doctor, raking his gaze over him, looking for clues to how he should react. "What are you talking about?" he said at last. "Just what I said. You've taken Sam Winchester's form. But whatever you are, you're not him," the doctor said. "You're empty. Whatever you are, you have the form but not the heart." Sam stood up straighter and narrowed his eyes. "I am Sam," he said. The doctor tipped his head nearly sideways and uncrossed his arms, walking a slow circle as Sam stood still, watching him the way a predator would, coiled and ready to strike if need be. "I think you believe that. But even if you are Sam, what's happened to you?" "Really?" Sam gestured with both hands. "Come on, now, doctor. You know the story of my family. Don't tell me you don't. The life of a time traveler, remember. You knew long before we did what was coming for us, and you know how Dean and I stopped Lucifer and Michael." He paused. "How I stopped them," he said, and the doctor suspected that his pride was only there because Dean wasn't. There was an echo of emotion there, but it was warped. The doctor stopped circling him. "Whatever happened, let me fix it." Sam narrowed his eyes and then turned around to go back to what he was doing, moving with his whole body. "I don't think it needs fixing, doctor. Besides, we have more important things to do." "More important than?" "Yes." The doctor narrowed his eyes but continued to stay back, watching Sam go to work. The boys were always concentrated when they were on a hunt, but again, this was different. But Sam picked up speed, and the doctor had to jog to keep up with him. Whatever was going on, he wasn't going to leave Sam alone on a hunt. He kept looking to see if he could spot Dean. He had so many questions. But how would they even find Sam if they got separated? Would he even care to look for them? And why was he even sticking around Dean? If he had lost the part of himself that cared, by the doctor's recollection, this would have been about the time that Dean had tried to quit the life. He'd had a cute little house, neighbors notwithstanding. Was this why he'd left all that behind? Then again, he totally understood the impulse. He couldn't resist the mystery that was Sam Winchester now, just like he couldn't resist trying to figure out what was going on with Clara. And that was a whole other train of thought. He still felt terrible about what had happened, and he wanted to figure out that mystery. He couldn't believe that Dean Winchester's final fate was to be a demon. There had to be a way to fix that. He just hadn't figured it out yet. At the very least, he could start researching in his spare time, or looking into a way to minimize what was happening. Maybe he could figure out whether or not the curse lasted past the death of the Earth. But then, time displacement could do funny things, and he didn't fully understand curses anyway. And if Dean was trapped with impulses of violence, with the worst side of him, maybe there was someplace he could go so he wouldn't hurt anyone. So that if he ever did get away from that curse, he wouldn't look back on everything that happened. While he had the mark with the level of guilt the Winchesters were known for, he wanted to do it. He wanted to save both of him. And since the doctor had seen the Winchesters around later in their timeline, and hadn't sensed this emptiness in Sam, maybe this was his shot to learn more about curses, to figure out how to free them. Maybe this could help him with the mark. Maybe it was similar. Or maybe he was just hoping for answers because he was an incurable optimist. He sighed to himself and then stopped when he saw Sam look back and glare at him for making too much noise. He had been good at stealth in previous bodies, but this one not so much, especially not when he was this distracted. The doctor held up both hands in a conciliatory gesture, and Sam rolled his eyes, but went back to what he was doing. And as for the doctor, he followed closely, his mind turning over the possibilities. But when he heard a piercing scream split the air, He had to table that particular train of thought, at least for the time being. There was a more immediate need. Dean had heard the scream echo through the forest and sprinted that way. He'd been following the same trail Sam had been, but he knew he was behind, no matter how fast he was. Hearing a scream meant he had a direction. He could book it. He could feel a few sharper plants pulling at his clothes and cutting a few lines into his skin, but he kept running and ran faster. When he heard the familiar high-pitched whine of the sonic screwdriver, of course the doctor had found trouble and thrown himself into the middle. He leaped over a fallen log and kept running, until he caught sight of a dilapidated cabin out there in the middle of nowhere. It looked like it belonged either to hunters or to rangers, but he was approaching from the back, and couldn't see anything to indicate who owned it. "Ha!" He heard the doctor cry out in triumph, and heard the sound of a lock coming undone, and then, someone screamed inside the house. The window on the back looked small enough that Dean wasn't sure he could fit his shoulders through if he tried, so he took off running again. The doctor and Sam were already inside. Dean heard gunshots a second after he got to the front door, and the door was wide open. So, Dean rushed inside and pulled up short when he saw the gory scene. The doctor had pulled a young woman away from Sam and the Rugeru. She was missing chunks from her forearm, where she had clearly tried to defend herself, and she was hyperventilating, crying into the doctor's side, while he tried to keep her calm. The Rugeru himself was already covered in blood, and some of it was his own, judging by the holes Sam had already put in him. He was crouched low and snarling, blood and bits of flesh dangling from his teeth, his eyes bloodshot, his fingers stretched out as if they were animal claws. "You got a medical degree to back up your title?" Dean called out as he drew his own gun to help Sam deal with the problem. Sam was in between him and the monster, so he started to circle and swore when the Rugeru pounced toward Sam. They were too close together. "Took you long enough," Sam shouted over to Dean as he managed to get his foot in between himself and the Rugeru, kicking hard enough to send the monster flying, until it collided with the other end of the small cabin. The impact knocked a few things off the wall, including a deer head with antlers long enough to scrape the Rugeru's face badly as it came down on him. "Had to stop and smell the flowers. You know me," Dean said before he unloaded into the Rugeru. The thing was fast enough to make a hard target, and the bullets didn't stop it as well as they should have, but enough hits, and it should go down. Bang! Sam shot the Rugeru just as it crouched to spring itself at Dean, leaving a hole in its head. And Dean fired 3 more just to be sure. For a long moment, the two of them stood in front of the dead body of the Rugeru, side by side, almost like it had always been. And then, Sam turned on his heel and walked out the door, leaving the doctor and Sam to the hysterical girl. Dean frowned toward Sam's back, but he figured Sam didn't have anywhere to go for the time being. Hopefully, with a sigh, he crouched down beside the doctor, who was still sitting with the girl as she cried into his stomach, absolutely beside herself, while the doctor did what he could for her wounds. "Let me help with that," Dean said, letting the doctor shift, so that he was more the emotional support than the physician. He made quick work of wrapping her arm, but winced. "You're gonna want to go to the that might get infected." The girl let out a sound that perfectly conveyed exactly how Dean would have felt about the situation in her shoes. "A bigger bill." Yeah, that sounded right. She was overwhelmed and annoyed at having yet one more thing put on her plate. "I get it," Dean said, sitting down in front of the doctor and the girl. "I hate doctors too." The girl let out a soft sob laugh. "I'm a nurse," she said. Dean winced in sympathy. "So you hate doctors more than me, right? Get to see the god complex up close and all?" The girl laughed again, starting to gain her composure with something else to focus on now that her arm wasn't in immediate need of attention. She still leaned heavily into the doctor, obviously exhausted from her order, but she turned toward Dean and regarded him more carefully. "Where did you even come from?" Dean grinned crookedly. "I get that one a lot," he said before he held his hand out to her. "Do you think you can walk?" he asked. "The doctor and I can put you between us if you need the extra help." The girl looked between the two of them and then nodded, though she winced her way through it as they got her upright. Dean and the doctor shared glances over the top of her head, but whatever they both wanted to talk about had to take a backseat for the moment. A civilian had been hurt, and they couldn't leave her there in the middle of nowhere. Not after they'd gone to all that effort to save her life. "We can give you a lift to the hospital, but after that, my brother and I need to get going," Dean told her in a low tone as they walked. "Going to go save another damsel in distress?" she asked. Now that she was coming back to herself, Dean liked the personality he saw poking out. If it hadn't been for Lisa and Ben at home, or if it hadn't been for the fact that she was so gravely injured, he would have turned up the charm even more than he already had it turned up. "That's the job description," Dean told her, grinning widely. "Lucky me." The doctor shook his head, his smirk barely restrained, though he looked past them toward Sam, and then nodded toward Dean. "Have you got her?" he asked softly. Dean nodded. "Yeah, of course." "Good," the doctor said. He pressed his mouth into a line as thin as his eyes were narrowed. "I'd like to have a talk with your brother." "Sam," the doctor called out, taking a few running steps to catch up to Sam, when the younger Winchester didn't stop or even turn to acknowledge him. "Doctor," Sam said coolly. And that was interesting again. Now that Dean wasn't around to see them, Sam had dropped even the bare pretenses he'd put up before. He wasn't trying to pretend things were normal. He wasn't downplaying the blank space in his mind. The doctor came to a stop, and this time, Sam stopped with him. "When did you notice something had gone wrong?" he asked, not giving Sam the option to pretend it was okay. Sam raised both eyebrows and crossed his arms. "What do you care anyway? You weren't around when the world nearly ended. What does the aftermath matter to you?" The doctor narrowed his eyes. "You weren't there for many times the world nearly ended, Sam," he said, his tone cooler than usual. "But no one was there. No one who cared." And the doctor, for as much as he loved the Winchesters, was not a jolly jester the boys could push around and blame for their problems. "I'll defend this world at every turn, but I won't fight every battle." Sam glared to match the doctor and then scoffed, turning on his heel. "Typical." The doctor walked around Sam to get in his path, his index finger out to poke him in the center of the chest. "You have to know there's nothing up there," he said, flicking his finger up to point at Sam's head. "You have to know it." "Yeah? And what do you expect me to do about it?" "Huh?" Sam asked. "Or did it occur to you that this is better?" "What are you talking about?" Sam knocked the doctor's head away from him. "Every slip-up we made leading up to that mess was because we were scared. Concerned for each other," the doctor said, but Sam waved him off. "Scared. And you're not scared anymore," the doctor guessed, frowning as he watched the way Sam's jaw tightened at the corner. He wasn't afraid, and he didn't care, but he was capable of violence, and that was dangerous. "No. And you don't care anymore." Sam paused just long enough that the doctor knew he knew the correct answer to the question. But again, it was just the two of them, and so he answered truthfully. "No." "I see." Sam narrowed his eyes again, nearly to slits. "What's your point, doctor?" he asked, a threat laced in his words that the doctor hated hearing directed toward him, though it wasn't a new feeling either. He knew that, no matter how much he and the Winchesters both spoke highly of each other, their relationship had always been tenuous. He wasn't human, and they were hunters. But this time, the threat didn't have any of the usual hesitation, any of the acknowledgement of their history. "I can try to fix it." "Don't." Sam pointed at the doctor, the threat further accentuated by the glare behind his eyes. "Whatever it was, I don't want it back." A smile twisted its way across his features. "Do you have any idea how much I used to hold back?" The doctor ignored the smile and took a step towards Sam, holding his gaze. "I get that. Actually," he said. "Do you have any idea how much I hold back?" he added, letting his voice drop as well. Sam stood up straighter, visibly reevaluating the doctor, both eyebrows raised as he looked him over. And then, he relaxed his stance entirely and let out a scoff of a laugh. "Nice, Doc. I was serious." "Yeah, I noticed." The doctor watched Sam, frowning, but before he could say anything else, he heard footsteps approaching, and saw Dean and the young woman they had rescued making their way toward the two of them. And so, the doctor pointed at Sam in a warning. "Talk to your brother about this. You can't think he doesn't know something's going on." "I don't know what I'd tell him," Sam pointed out. "You don't know what happened either." "I can look into it." "Sure, Doc. And when we see you in a couple years, I'm sure that'll be real helpful." The doctor felt the corner of his jaw tighten because that was actually a good jab. He was precise now when he brought Clara to and from her home, but the boys hadn't always known him to be. "Well, Sam, this has been enlightening," he said, his tone brighter again as Dean and the girl approached. "Always is," Sam said, also slipping into something a little more approachable as Dean joined them. And that was interesting, too. Even though Sam said he didn't care anymore, he was making an actual effort to shield Dean from the worst of whatever had left him that empty. It was like part of him remembered how important Dean was to him, and in service of that memory of care, he was willing to change his behavior just enough that it could count as affection, if looked at sideways. But then, that was the Winchesters. Not much could get between them. "You two out here gossiping about me?" Dean asked with a crooked grin that made the girl he was looking after smile too. Which, of course, had him grinning even wider. Again, some things never changed, and the doctor was almost tempted to tell him to stop it, just to see what that felt like in this body, and to see how Dean would react. But instead, he waved Dean over. "How are you feeling?" he asked the girl with him. "Much better, thank you," the girl said. She was smiling, but she was obviously hurting as well. Best that the doctor get out of the way so the Winchesters could get her to help. He could check in with them without listening ears. "So, I guess this is where we part ways," Sam said pointedly. "Ah, so that was how he wanted to play this." The doctor gave him a pointed look, but Dean was flirting and missed it. "I can stay," he said, but Sam was already shaking his head. "We've got places to be." "Yeah, gotta get out of here before someone decides this was all our fault." Again, Dean said. "We'll see you next time the TARDIS wants to say hello," Sam said. "Tell her I'll miss her," Dean added, his grin warmer. The doctor frowned between them, but before he could think of something to say, the two of them fell into step with each other, seamlessly moving as one, almost as if nothing had changed. Almost. River Song had come to this spot hoping to spend some time with the Winchesters. Every girl needed a good friend to go kill things with, and Dean was usually up for the best kinds of adventures if she asked. She was, after all, a self-professed psychopath, and she liked to let that part of herself out every once in a while. This time, happily, she saw not just the Winchesters but the doctor trudging out of the woods, and she grinned easily, waving to the three of them and the woman who was clearly flirting with Dean, through a haze of blood loss. "Looks like you boys have your hands full," she said. Dean broke into a grin, and the doctor let out a disbelieving laugh as she bounced over to him. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a tone full of affection, which meant he was late enough in his timeline that he knew who she was and had not only gotten used to, but enjoyed her company. She loved when she found him at that point in her timeline. Smiling even wider than before, she leaned over to kiss the doctor's cheek. "Hello, sweetie." "Hello, dear," he said, and the phrase made her heart race. Oh, so he was at a point he'd play with her too. Perfect. She could already feel herself mentally switching the purpose of this trip from playing with Dean or Sam to playing with the doctor. "We can just leave," Dean offered, his crooked grin telling River that he knew exactly where her head was. He was a good wingman. That was why she kept him around. "It looks like you already had all the fun without me," River said, nodding to the young woman. "Yeah, monster running around town eating people," Sam said. "And I missed it," River said. The young woman frowned at River and pulled slightly away from Dean. She was still obviously leaning on him, but their open enjoyment of the hunt had visibly put her off, and River felt bad about that. What kind of a wingwoman was she being? "I see you made a friend," River said. Dean shrugged easily. "Actually, we're on our way to the hospital." Well then, she didn't feel as bad about not being a good wingwoman if he wasn't taking the bait. He must have been seeing someone, then. But he looked a bit young for it to be that handsome angel. Spoilers, she reminded herself. "So, were you just looking for an adventure?" Sam asked, and something about his tone made River turn toward him, frowning. Where was the warmth? Where was the curiosity? He was always the more serious Winchester brother, but this was something else entirely. The doctor saw her look and met her gaze, and without a word spoken between them, she knew he had more to say about the situation than he was willing to say in front of the boys. And wasn't that interesting? "Can't a girl come out to play every once in a while?" she asked Sam, who shook his head at her. "Betcha we can find another case for you," Dean offered. "There's always something else." "Isn't there always?" she agreed. She bit her lip as she looked between the brothers, the injured woman, and the doctor. In a second, she made her decision and looped her arm through the doctor's. "You have some explaining to do." The doctor grinned at her. "Let me catch you up," he agreed. The boys left with the injured woman, and River pulled the doctor aside to a quiet spot, brushing his hair out of his face. "You're older than the last time I saw you," she said. "And you're younger. Something to look forward to." Then, she said, smiling wider before she leaned forward to kiss his cheek. "So, tell me, what's going on with those two?" "I haven't figured that out yet," the doctor admitted. "You must have theories." "Oh, 127, he agreed, and she laughed. That was her doctor. "So tell me more." The doctor gestured toward where they had left the Winchesters. "I can't say I understand the things they fight. The universe is vast, and the unknown is exciting." "Yes," River said, her eyes sparkling. The doctor smiled wider, especially as River took the opportunity to step even closer into his space. She loved when she got to play with him. The younger versions were frustratingly shy sometimes. Still wearing a smile at the corner of his mouth, the doctor said, "There's something missing from Sam's mind." River tipped her head nearly sideways. "Now, that is new. Do you know what it is?" "Yes and no," the doctor said. "His mind is still intact, but it's as if the memories and knowledge are unchanged, but the person is gone. So, his soul is missing, River said, pressing her lips together. She'd seen an older version of Sam recently, and he hadn't been like this. So obviously, the problem would get solved. But how? The doctor turned toward her. Maybe, he said, and she could see the question just behind his gaze. Even if she didn't know for sure what was happening, she also knew the rules. She knew how important they were. And so, with a flirtatious smile, she simply said, "Spoilers. Too bad about your timing." Dean said, his hands in his pockets as he walked with River, Sam, and the doctor. After their quick stop at the hospital, Sam and Dean wanted to get out of there. But River had asked them to walk with them back to the TARDIS, at the very least, and Dean had never been good at telling River no. She was too much fun. "I don't know what you're talking about. My timing is perfect," River said, pinching the doctor's side with a crooked grin. "Right? Obviously," Dean said, shaking his head. It was kind of wild seeing the doctor actually participating in the flirting. He had believed River when she said that she loved the doctor, and he had believed her when she talked about their relationship. But it was still something else watching them interact, especially since he'd met Rose before, and that relationship was so different from the one he had with River. It was complicated, the way everything was complicated with the doctor. But then, it wasn't like he could talk. "So, are you two headed off together, then?" Sam asked. "I do feel like I missed out on an adventure," River said. "Any ideas, sweetie?" "I might have a few." Yeah, get a room, you two," Dean said, and didn't miss the fact that River grinned his way for it. "And what about you boys? Want to come with us?" River asked. "Not interested," Sam said dryly. River laughed. "You're lost," she said, and didn't address which implication she was talking about. "Could be fun to take the TARDIS for a joyride again," Dean said, just for the look on Sam's face, as he turned his whole body toward Dean. "We have other things to do." "Might be a faster way to get me back home," Dean pointed out. "Might be a fast way to get you home 10 years from now, too. Not if River drives." "Hey," the doctor said as River hung onto his shoulders and laughed. "Oh, you act like he's wrong," she said and kissed the doctor's cheek again. "I'm starting to see why you keep popping over here when you need space to run," the doctor said, though he had turned neatly so that he and River were nearly nose to nose. They got to the spot where the TARDIS was parked, and the doctor snapped his fingers to get the doors to open, strolling inside with River, already talking in a scientific, futuristic lingo only they understood. Neither Sam nor Dean had seen him do that before, but when Dean looked towards Sam, he didn't see the surprised look he had expected. Instead, Sam raised one eyebrow and didn't make a comment. Dean shook his head and walked past Sam into the TARDIS, stroking the wall as he passed her. He opened his mouth to say hello, but before he could do that, the doors snapped shut behind him, and he heard the telltale whine of the TARDIS engine. "Doc, what's going on?" he shouted, spinning to look at the door. Sam wasn't there with them. "What's the big idea?" Was all the doctor said, frantically working at the controls. "Calm down, you old thing," he told the TARDIS, shaking his head. "You know better than this." "What's he talking about?" Dean asked River, but River ignored him in favor of diving in to help the doctor, muttering to him a few times before. With a thud, the TARDIS landed, and both of them looked up at Dean. "So," River said after a moment, brushing her hair out of her face, "apparently, whatever's going on with Sam, the TARDIS doesn't like it at all." "Are you kidding?" Dean gestured at the TARDIS console. "Take me back. Right now." Hold on," the doctor said, holding both hands up. "Now, wait a minute. I can absolutely take you back to exactly where you were. So do that. And not know where we've been?" Dean narrowed his eyes, his arms crossed. Normally, he would have been tempted. Normally, he would have loved the chance to go out into time and space. It would have been a great distraction, a great adventure. "But you said whatever's wrong with him freaked out the TARDIS. I didn't even know that was possible." "Actually, it's happened before," the doctor said, wincing one shoulder up. "I think you met Jack Harkness before, right?" Dean's eyebrows rose along with his chin. "Yeah, noticed he couldn't die last time I spent time with him. Are you saying it's something like that?" "Apparently." The doctor rubbed the console a few more times, as if he were trying to calm down a spooked horse. "It's all right?" River shook her head and stepped back to stand beside Dean, crossing her arms alongside him. "Can't hurt to peek outside, can it?" she asked. "The TARDIS is freaked out by my brother. Let's go back now. Give her time to calm down," the doctor said, already heading for the door. So Dean knew arguing was pointless. Dean rolled his eyes but, knowing he couldn't fly the TARDIS alone when the doctor was right there, He needed the TARDIS's cooperation to pull off something like that, and he was pretty sure he was only able to do it in a short jump anyway. He followed the doctor out the doors. The first thing that hit him was sunlight, and he raised his hand to block it out, so he could see better. And despite everything, despite how worried he was for Sam, despite how much he knew this was the doctor's attempt to distract him or cheer him up or something, he broke into a smile. They were unmistakably on an alien planet. The sky was an almost electric blue, and the air around them was charged in a way that had the hairs on Dean's arms standing up. Or, no, wait, something else was charging, and Dean didn't realize it until he heard the sound of some kind of futuristic gun firing. And he heard a recognizable "exterminate." Part of the rock near River's head exploded, and she didn't bother to hide her laugh of delight at the near miss. This was what she'd been hoping to find when she'd gone looking for the Winchesters, and the TARDIS had delivered. The doctor, of course, was having the complete opposite reaction, grumbling under his breath about the Daleks, cursing the TARDIS for landing on Skaro, when he'd been trying to convince Dean to travel with them, and checking on her to make sure the near miss really had missed. She waved him off immediately. "I'm fine," she said, though she did take his hand when he offered it to pull her to her feet. "Anyone want to explain to me where we are?" Dean asked, annoyed, his back pressed against the rock wall as he reloaded his shotgun. It had been a good thing he'd been hunting a Rugeru when they ran into him and his brother. He wasn't carrying salt rounds for that hunt. "This is the Dalek homeworld," the doctor explained. "Shoot for the eyes," River said, and Dean pointed at her in thanks. "I can do that," he said, already peeking around the edge of the wall to see what kind of angle he could get from where they were. River smirked. That was why she considered Dean a friend. Put a problem in front of him and tell him what needed shooting, and in what order. And when she looked to her left to see that the doctor was frowning still, she shook her head and squeezed his hand. "Why here, though?" the doctor asked, mostly to himself. "Why take us here after getting away from Sam?" If the TARDIS was just setting a random course, River started to say, but the doctor shook his head. "No, not this time," he said. He ducked, and part of the wall where his head had been came away. The Dalek who had shot at them started to scream the doctor's name in the unsettling, high-pitched whine of a voice that they all used. But before others could take up the call, Dean shot it through the eye stalk, and it went careening sideways, its head spinning as it screamed. "Well, it's blind," Dean announced, then threw himself flat to the ground when the Dalek started to fire indiscriminately. "Anything more permanent?" "Just keep going until it stops moving," River offered, though the doctor was already at work on something with his sonic screwdriver, adjusting the settings until, all at once, the random shooting stopped, and he let out a ha of triumph. "Thanks, Doc," Dean said, dusting himself off before he extended a hand to both the doctor and River, to offer help to their feet. Once everyone was upright, the doctor once again turned toward the TARDIS, and narrowed his eyes when he and River both saw, on the horizon, several Daleks flying their way. There was no way they hadn't noticed a TARDIS landing on their world. They'd be surrounded soon. "Back to the TARDIS," the doctor said. "No arguments here," Dean muttered under his breath, though he did shoot the Dalek again just for good measure, and wrinkled his nose when it started to scream at him. "These things are unnerving. Remind me to tell you more about them when we're out of here," the doctor said. "You like a good horror story, don't you?" River asked, and Dean chuckled dryly. "Yeah, my day job's not gory enough." "Thought so," she said. He gave her a brilliant grin as they reached the TARDIS, and reached for the door to hold it open for the two of them. She could see the quip on the tip of his tongue, and was already grinning as she waited for it. Except he didn't make it to the door. Instead, he reached for the TARDIS, and some kind of shield not only prevented him from touching the TARDIS, but blew him back several meters. He skidded in the loose gravel around them and lay still, twitching at the very edges of his fingers. River and the doctor shared urgent glances before the doctor rushed to Dean while River stood watch, narrowing her eyes at the steadily approaching Daleks. Everything about this screamed that they were in for a fight, and she was more than happy to give them what they were looking for. The real challenge would be doing that while keeping her husband and her friends safe. The Daleks on the horizon were the most obvious threat to watch, but she saw something moving on the crest of a nearby hill. Without turning her head or her body, she noted the position of whoever was watching them, even as she called over her shoulder to the doctor. "We okay back there?" "Looks like a reverse time lock." The feedback would have been worse if he was a Time Lord, the doctor said, kneeling down next to Dean and frowning to himself. "Could have been much worse. It looks like they threw this up remotely, so if we can find out which one of them is powering the field, we can get out of here." "I might have an idea of where to look," River said, though she still didn't look toward the movement she'd spotted. The doctor glanced up at her, raised both eyebrows when he recognized her expression as she met his gaze, and then simply nodded. "We don't have much time," he said pointedly. "Do we ever?" She shot back just for the look on his face, the look that was always on that particular face when she flirted with him. The doctor smirked at her and went back to trying to get Dean to rouse right up, until the Daleks headed their way simply exploded. Neither of them had seen it coming, and all either of them could do was duck for cover, with the doctor shielding Dean's body as best he could from the shrapnel. All three of them were covered in smoke and blood, only some of which was theirs, and they all had parts of Daleks all over them, including in the bits of metal that cut lines along their skin. But other than being bloody and shocked, they were all relatively okay. The Daleks, on the other hand, were in pieces. One single Dalek had managed to avoid the blast, but as River watched, a familiar sound echoed over the cliffs, and that Dalek exploded as well, though not as spectacularly. And River couldn't hide her curiosity. She recognized the sound of that weapon. It was banned in several galaxies, and it was Dalek-made. Someone on those cliffs was on their side. She wiped blood away from her eyes and looked toward where she'd seen movement before. And there, for just the smallest fraction of a second, she was sure that she saw Dean Winchester. The end.